Imagine Britain in a time before roads and Roman legions, before Caesar's skiffs broke the horizon, in an era when the land itself seemed to breathe with a different music. Forests arced over river valleys like green cathedrals, marshes held secrets in their soft beds, and coastlines shifted with tides that felt more urgent than any human law. People moved through this landscape with intimate knowledge, reading tracks in mud, listening for birds that spoke of change, and following seasonal patterns that shaped life more surely than any edict. This was the long, slow dawn of tribal kingdoms, an age of beginnings that would whisper into later histories even when its voices were transformed into myth. Most will only read about it. Few would dare live it. Subscribe if you'd have had the courage to roam that untamed Britain at the dawn of kingdoms. The earliest chapters belong to those who lived by the slow rhythms of hunter-gatherer life. Small bands followed herds, fished rivers, and took shelter in caves or temporary huts, leaving behind flint blades and hearths that archaeologists would one day find and puzzle over. Their world was one of constant movement, of intimate knowledge of plants and animals, of a spirituality tied to the immediate landscape rather than a distant throne. Over generations, those bands grew larger, settled more often, and began to shape the land more deliberately, laying foundations for societies that would look to territory and kin as sources of power. With the Neolithic came a profound shift. People began to farm. Wheat and barley, introduced across the sea from continental neighbors, changed how communities organized themselves. Farming meant staying put through seasons, building new kinds of houses that lasted, and investing labor in fields, fences, and storage. Along with that permanence came new social forms, cooperation in clearing land, systems to store and distribute grain, and the slow accretion of unequal wealth as some families accumulated more resources than others. As communities settled, they also began to reshape the landscape in unmistakable ways. Fields were cleared and terraces cut into hillsides, while monumental constructions rose from plain earth and rock. Earthen banks and ditches, long barrows, and later ceremonial complexes began to mark the countryside with human intent. These constructions were not mere practicalities, they were statements of belonging, of ritual, and of memory, places where people gathered to mark births, deaths, and the cycles of the year. Perhaps the most famous of these creations is the circle of stones, those silent sentinels that still stagger the imagination. Stone circles were assembled with remarkable effort, sometimes bringing massive rocks across miles of uneven ground. They were not simply tools of observation, though alignments with solstices and astronomical events suggest a sophisticated awareness of the sky. More than that, they were shared stages for rites that bound communities together, for leaders to present themselves, and for the living to converse with ancestors. From the agricultural revolution sprang denser communities and the beginnings of social ranking. Some families held more land or richer fields, and social roles diversified into specialists, skilled flint workers, potters, weavers, and those who mediated rituals. Power was still often personal, centered on charismatic figures who could lead hunts, organize building works, or hold people in a circle with words and presence. These leaders were precursors of chieftains, people whose authority blended practical skill with symbolic potency. By the Bronze Age, metalworking transformed both tools and status. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, arrived through trade and experimentation, creating sharper tools and more elaborate ornaments. The ability to produce metal objects became a new axis of prestige. Those who controlled metalworking or the trade networks that brought raw materials could convert those advantages into greater wealth and influence. Weapons and ornaments signed authority on the battlefield and in ceremonial settings alike, and metal hoards buried in the ground hint at both wealth and ritual choices. Trade had long been a part of Britain's story, even before grand kingdoms arose. Amber from the Baltic, copper from the Iberian Peninsula, and tin from far western shores moved across a web of exchange that linked communities along rivers and coasts. Boats and simple harbors became arteries of contact, and with trade came ideas as much as goods. Shared pottery styles, artistic motifs, and techniques spread across islands and mainland Europe, knitting disparate groups into a broader world of influence. As populations grew and competition for fertile land intensified, the need for defense and the assertion of territorial control sharpened. Hill forts began to rise on dominating ridges, not exclusively military strongholds but complex centers that combined refuge, trade, storage, and ritual. These places stand as clear evidence that leadership was becoming more centralized. They could hold large numbers of people at a time of crisis, but they also functioned as centers where power was displayed and negotiated on a daily basis. Within those emerging centers, the figure of the chieftain crystallized into something more complex. Chieftains were not simply warlords, they were organizers, judges, and ceremonial leaders who embodied the identity of a community or a coalition of communities. Their authority often rested on personal loyalty and reputation, but they also managed wealth, arranged marriages, and led rituals that reinforced a sense of common fate. Loyalty to a leader could be fluid, yet the chieftain's role created a focal point around which larger social units could cohere. Underlying these political forms were intricate kinship networks that structured obligations and alliances. Family lines mattered, not only for inheritance of property but for political ties through marriage. Alliances linked kin groups across valleys and along coasts, creating a lattice of obligations that sometimes endured through generations. When those bonds frayed, conflict could erupt, but when they held, they allowed leaders to mobilize labor for grand projects and muster warriors in defense or conquest. War in this epoch was often personal and seasonal, rarely a prolonged campaign like the wars of later empires. Skirmishes, raids, and displays of force served to settle scores, assert dominance, or acquire cattle and goods. At times, these conflicts could escalate into larger battles, especially when resources were at stake or ambitions reached beyond local borders. Martial prowess was a key part of leadership charisma, and heroic reputations could be built and maintained in song and memory. Religion and ritual permeated the life of these communities in ways that modern observers sometimes underappreciate. Sacred landscapes developed around springs, groves, and hilltops, places where people felt the presence of forces beyond the ordinary. Ritual specialists emerged to mediate between the seen and unseen, to mark the turning of seasons, to bless harvests, and to inter the dead in ways that aligned with communal beliefs. These beliefs were not uniform across Britain. Variation was the norm, with practices adapting to local histories and landscapes. Language played a role in the identity of these communities, though its exact contours are difficult to reconstruct. Scholars debate the arrival and spread of Indo-European speech and its local variants, but by the late prehistoric period certain linguistic currents had shaped much of Britain. Language served as both a practical tool for coordination and a marker of belonging, with dialects and specialized registers used in ritual speech, greetings, and negotiation. Even where we cannot hear the exact words, patterns of naming places and people leave traces of linguistic life. Material culture can tell us more than might appear at first glance. Pottery styles, beadwork, and the way houses were built revealed preferences, practical needs, and symbolic choices. Houses arranged around hearths, with spaces for storage and craft, give a sense of domestic rhythm. Objects found in graves or hoards often carry meanings of identity and memory, sometimes intentionally broken or ritually deposited to mark transitions in a community's life. The long contact with the continent ensured that Britain was never isolated, even in its most inward-looking moments. People, goods, and ideas flowed across the Channel and along the Atlantic seaways, sometimes peacefully through trade, sometimes more turbulently in the wake of migration and conflict. These contacts brought new technologies and fashions, but the exchanges were two-way. British tin, for instance, fed metalworkers on the continent, and British styles left their imprint in foreign graves. This networked world made the idea of distinct tribes both more compelling and more complex than simple labels allow. The word tribe itself requires some unpacking. It suggests a coherent, bounded people with a uniform culture and leadership, but the reality on the ground was messier. Tribal identity was often nested, with smaller kin groups belonging to larger polities that could shift their boundaries with marriage, alliance, or conquest. Leaders emphasized continuity and unity when it served them, but identities could be fluid, accommodating newcomers and absorbing differences in a pragmatic way. Recognizing this fluidity helps us imagine a landscape of overlapping loyalties rather than rigid national boxes. As we move closer to the Iron Age, new patterns of settlement and power emerge more sharply. Iron tools and weapons, once experimental, become widespread, altering agriculture and warfare alike. Iron axes cut trees more efficiently, iron plows turned heavier soils, and iron spearheads changed how combat unfolded. The availability of iron reshaped economies and social hierarchies, and the distribution of iron resources and manufacturing centers became another factor in the rise of regional powers. The Iron Age also saw the flowering of distinctive artistic styles that express both local taste and shared symbolism. Decorative motifs, curved lines, spirals, and natural forms adorned metalwork and pottery, signaling affiliation and status. Ornament was not mere decoration but a language of identity, readable to those who knew the codes. Such art could mark the presence of an elite, and objects could function as both currency of exchange and as visible proof of taste and legitimacy. Hill forts in the Iron Age often became larger and more complex, with multiple phases of construction and reoccupation over centuries. They could enclose villages, create marketplaces, and concentrate craft production. Inside their ramparts, different activities took place: smithing, weaving, children learning trades, elders resolving disputes, and leaders deliberating. These fortifications connected economy, defense, and ritual, shaping the rhythm of daily life and the broader geopolitics of the region. Within those fortifications, inequality could become more pronounced. Some hill forts held visible signs of elite wealth, richly furnished burials, imported goods, and impressive houses set apart from ordinary dwellings. Elite status was maintained through displays of generosity and control of critical resources, such as grain stores, metalworking facilities, or sea-based trade routes. Yet those elites depended on the consent and labor of many, and their authority had to be continually demonstrated through feasts, warfare, and ritual. Feasting was a central element of social life and political strategy. Large communal feasts redistributed food and goods, cemented alliances, and marked important events. Preparing for a feast demanded organization and resources, and the ability to host such gatherings became a form of prestige. Feasts were occasions for storytelling and the performance of social memory, where leaders reaffirmed loyalties through shared consumption and display. Religion continued to adapt as societies changed, absorbing new symbols and practices even while retaining older impulses. Sacred deposits in bogs and rivers, sometimes of weapons or carefully made objects, suggest an ongoing dialogue with forces perceived as sacred or powerful. Burial practices varied. Some elite individuals were interred with wealth and status, others received simpler rites, and in some areas cremation gave way to inhumation or vice versa over time. These ritual choices carried messages about social order, cosmology, and the nature of personhood. Ritual specialists, whether priests, seers, or knowledge holders, could become power brokers in their own right. They mediated relationships with the supernatural, advised leaders, and were often custodians of oral tradition, genealogies, and law. Their authority derived from perceived access to other realms and from the social utility of their roles. In times of drought or plague, their significance might heighten. In times of peace, they could be central to education and rites of passage. The archaeological record offers glimpses of childhood and daily life that are easily overshadowed by monuments and battles. Children learned trades by imitation, played with small clay toys, and contributed to household chores. Women managed intricate domestic economies, weaving cloth, tending the household, and playing key roles in kinship and alliance through marriage. These routines, mundane as they might sound, knit communities together in ways essential to their resilience and creativity. Gender roles in the tribal kingdoms were diverse and adaptable rather than fixed boxes. While many societies saw distinct spheres for men and women, with men often taking lead in overt warfare and hunting and women more visible in domestic management and ritual, there were also exceptional individuals whose roles crossed boundaries. Stories and burial evidence sometimes hint at women warriors or men in ceremonial positions not confined to a single social function. The social fabric allowed for flexibility, especially at moments of crisis or change. Economies were deeply local but nested within wider exchange networks. Farmsteads produced surplus grain, livestock, and crafted goods that could be traded for raw materials, prestige items, or specialized services. Markets emerged near hill forts and coastal hubs, where seasonal fairs and regular exchanges enabled a flow of goods and information. Money as coinage was not yet a standard, but value circulated through objects, livestock, and reciprocal obligations that bound people together over time. The sea remained a persistent presence in the lives of coastal communities. Boats, not just as instruments of trade but as symbols of mobility and freedom, allowed people to cross channels and reach islands. Coastal chiefs could control seaways, exact tolls, and secure resources from distant shores. The maritime dimension created strategic advantages and fostered cultural diversity where seafaring communities mixed continental influences with local traditions. As regional polities matured, larger confederations sometimes emerged under powerful domination. Charismatic leaders or ambitious dynasties could draw multiple communities into coalitions that exercised control over broad territories. These coalitions could last for decades or unravel within a generation. Their cohesion depended on the interplay of tribute, kinship, and the leader's ability to perform authority publicly. Such formations resemble kingdoms in process, nascent states trying on the garments of sovereignty without the uniform administration of later empires. When Rome first looked toward Britain, its observers saw a land of many peoples and polities, each with its own customs and leaders. Classical authors wrote of tribes with broad strokes: the Belgae, the Iceni, the Brigantes, names that clung to places and later historiography. Yet those names seldom captured internal diversity or the shifting alliances that characterized pre-Roman Britain. They do, however, reflect the scale at which some polities operated and the ways in which outside observers sought to map the island's political landscape. Ironically, it was contact with an imperial power that would fix many of these fluid identities into sharper shapes. Roman campaigns, diplomacy, and later administration created new boundaries and new centers of power, but the roots of those later polities were deeply embedded in the pre-Roman centuries. Local leaders adapted to the presence of Rome in myriad ways. Some resisted fiercely, others negotiated, and some leveraged Roman contact to bolster their own position. These responses illuminate the complexity of indigenous politics rather than reducing it to simple opposition. Memory and myth preserved the outline of the pre-Roman world in stories that would be retold for centuries. Heroic cycles, genealogies, and origin tales linked people to ancestors and landscapes, giving moral shape to political claims. In later centuries, these stories were reshaped, woven into new narratives that served medieval kings and chroniclers, but their roots remain prehistoric. Listening to traditions with a sensitive ear, one can still hear echoes of the hill forts, the feasts, and the seasonal rites that gave early Britain its particular music. Archaeology continues to refine our image of those ancient tribal kingdoms, bringing new techniques to bear on old questions. Radiocarbon dating can place a hearth or burial within decades rather than centuries. Isotopic analysis can reveal diets and migrations, and landscape archaeology maps the networks that tied settlements together. Each new method complicates simple narratives, revealing local adaptations, long-distance ties, and unexpected movements of people and goods. The past proves both stubborn and generous, always withholding some certainties while offering new glimpses. In the end, the dawn of the tribal kingdoms is not a single event but a protracted process, centuries in which humans experimented with ways to live together, to command labor, to remember, and to make meaning. It is an era of incremental innovations and dramatic gestures, of hearths and hill forts, of trade winds and seasonal feasts. If we listen closely, we can hear the interlaced voices of farmers, smiths, traders, and ritual specialists shaping a world that would, in time, meet Rome at the water's edge and become something else. If you drive across the British landscape today and glance at a ridge crowned by ancient earthworks or a solitary stone, remember that those marks are the residue of decisions, alliances, and stories that mattered deeply to people long gone. Each monument, each scatter of pottery, each burial is a thread in a vast tapestry that binds us to those first polities. They invite us not to imagine a static past, but a living one, in which people debated, built, sang, and fought for futures that would reach far beyond their own day. So let the picture settle, a land of marshes and meadows, of boats on gray waters, of smoke curling from roundhouses, of chieftains whose fortunes depended on skill and favor, and of communities that found meaning in shared rites and seasonal work. In that picture, the tribal kingdoms are not simply precursors to empire, but fully realized worlds with their own logics and poetries. Their dawn gave Britain a human shape that would endure, transform, and persist in ways that continue to shape identity and imagination to this day. The morning opens on a landscape where mist clings to hedgerow and hollow, and the first light reveals the dark skeletons of oaks on a distant ridge. In those trees, in that living architecture, the people of ancient Britain believed that the world held voices, spirits carried on the wind, ancestors resting in root and bough, gods woven into the textures of leaf and bark. These groves were private and public at once, a place where a family might come to honor a household spirit and where the tribe would come to consult its elder or priest. To step into a sacred wood was to step into an older rule, one that measured human life against the slow patience of trees and the cycle of seasons. You can imagine the grove as a cathedral without walls, its columns living and breathing, its floor carpeted with moss and fallen leaves. The air is a subtle chorus, birds answer one another, insects make a constant silver sound, and distant water gives a thin, steady note where spring breaks the hard ground to remind you of the underworld and of renewal. When a ritual began, people entered with a careful silence, as if making room for the memories that linger in a place used by forebears. Offerings were left in hollows, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes simply laid down, never thoughtless because the grove was an interlocutor rather than an inanimate setting. The figures who knew how to read that natural script were the Druids, though we must approach their image with caution. Most of what we know comes from outsiders who watched with curiosity, suspicion, and often political motive. Romans described these figures as priests, judges, and philosophers, steeped in learning and absent from the typical transactions of daily life. In truth, some acted as arbiters and ritual specialists, others as storytellers, herbalists, and carriers of genealogies. Their authority came from memory, from the ability to recite laws and lineages that bound people across generations. They performed rites in groves and near springs, they named the seasons and advised on oaths, and they were pivotal in the maintenance of social order, even if their exact rituals remained shadowed by time. The society that filled these woods and fields was not monolithic. Britain was a patchwork of tribal kingdoms, each with its own customs, heroes, and opposing neighbors. A chief's power was often personal and tied to reputation. His command was won by gifts, by displays of leadership in war and feast, and by the alliances he could secure. Beneath the leader existed a complex network of kinship and obligation, households that produced food and craft, warriors who defended the settlement and collected tribute, and freemen who judged and swapped labor for status. There were hill forts where men gathered in stone and earth, places whose ramparts still cut the skyline like a crown of soil. These fortifications were more than military works. They were centers of storage and industry, markets under oak and timber, and stages for ceremonial life. Inside, you would find roundhouses clustered around a central space, smoke drifting from low thatched eaves. Children chasing one another past the granaries while potters worked clay into shapes that later historians would call common and yet were refined in hand. The hill fort was a living organism with households weaving the threads of daily need into a civic body. At the heart of many settlements was craft, quietly brilliant and utterly necessary. Metalworkers heated furnaces until the coal glow painted their faces, drawing shapes from bronze and later iron that declared status and skill. Torques and brooches and weapons were more than ornaments, they were statements of identity and connection, carrying spirals and animals in the Latin style that linked the island to a wider European conversation and visual language. The same skill found expression in textiles, where wool was carded, spun, and dyed with woad, weld, and other pigments made from the land, producing garments that warmed the body and marked the wearer in social terms. Trade knit these communities into a broader web. Salt carried value like a quiet coin, amber from the Baltic glowed on necklaces, and imported Mediterranean wine flowed into some elite households as both luxury and diplomatic offering. These items did not come from nowhere. People navigated rivers and coasts, beeswax and hides, and sometimes crossed the channel to exchange goods and ideas. With trade came stories from distant places, technologies that were adapted to local needs, and the prestige of foreign objects used to bolster local relationships. Wealth and appearance mattered in a culture where reputation was almost a living currency. Warriors polished their helmets and cared for weapons that symbolized their honor, not just their ability to harm. Torques lay heavy on necks as badges of achievement, and the pattern of hair and beard could be a statement as loud as any shout on the battlefield. Clothing was tactile identity, woven patterns, dyed cloth, and fastenings that declared kinship, rank, and sometimes a man's or woman's role in ritual life. The warrior in this world was conceived differently than the lone champion of later romance. War was an extension of politics and kinship, a dangerous and public scholarship of reputation. Young men learned to be fighters through hunting, wrestling contests, mock combats, and by listening to sagas of ancestors whose courage kept their clans in the land. Combat itself was varied: raids, ambushes in broken terrain, and pitched clashes on the open ridge, and success required not only bravado but also discipline, cunning, and the ability to read weather and landscape. Weapons were made with an artisan's eye and a practicality born of necessity. Spears were versatile and could be thrown or braced, swords were luxurious and costly, axes were work tools turned slaughter weapons, and slings carried death at a distance in the hands of a trained thrower. Shields came in curved forms and were canvassed with leather and sometimes painted with motifs that would identify a group on the field. Armor was not universal. Many fought with padded leather and a fierce willingness to move, relying on skill and the sturdiness of a shield and helmet were available. By the river and marsh, water held a particular sanctity. Rivers were not merely transport routes and boundaries, they were living channels to a liminal world. Springs bubbled as if from some subterranean hearth, and wells were places of communion where votive offerings were slipped into dark water, weapons, small metal objects, and sometimes beads wrapped in delicate bindings. Those offerings were not waste but investment, a communication with powers who could tilt fortune toward a family in childbirth or a chieftain in war. Seasonal life knit human activity to the turnings of the year. There were times for sowing and harvest, for killing and curing meat, for bringing animals into winter barns and moving them to summer pastures. But these were also spiritual markers. The calendar shaped festivals that bound communities in ritual, fires to mark thresholds, feasts that redistributed wealth through hospitality, and sacrifices that acknowledged both gratitude and the fear that the world might tip. Such celebrations established rhythms that made time comprehensible and social obligations visible. Feasting was a crucial medium of politics and identity. A great feast was a public demonstration of a leader's generosity and a social mechanism for rewarding loyalty. Tables were piled with meat, grains, and bread, and mead or ale flowed in abundance as stories were told and disputes were aired before the assembly. Feasting bound the community in ways that a law could not, transforming food into the glue of social contracts and memory. Law itself was not written on stone as in later centuries, it was embodied in speech and in customary practice. Disputes were settled in gatherings where elders and peers argued, witnesses were called, memories were recited, and sentences were pronounced. Compensation for wrongs, whether cattle or land or honor, was negotiated in the light of genealogy and precedent, and these settlements were enforced by the community through relationships of obligation and the threat of expulsion or blood feud. Kinship in these societies was both expansive and intimate. Extended families formed the backbone of labor and protection, sharing the tasks of plowing, herding, and child rearing, while alliances between families through marriage created nets of mutual obligation that could include fosterage. To be raised in another household was not abandonment but a deliberate strategy to tie households together, to teach a child multiple loyalties that could later be called upon in crisis. This practice made social ties both flexible and resilient, an investment in the network of obligation that sustained survival. Women's roles in this world were central and varied, sometimes hidden from the gaze of later chroniclers but vivid in daily impact. Women wove and cooked, brewed and healed, and in many places they held responsibilities in succession and the maintenance of household law. Some women were recognized as leaders in their own right, commanding respect within and beyond their clan. And stories of warrior queens or women who spoke in assembly are part of the historical record when we read it carefully. Elders and mothers carried stories, genealogies, and practical knowledge, herbal remedies and patterns of sewing that kept the tribe capable across seasons. Birth and death were rites of passage that stitched individuals into the communal fabric. Childbirth took place amid women who knew the herbs and the positions that eased labor, and names were chosen to place the child in a line of descent and expectation. When death came, it was a rupture and a recalibration, a moment when the living negotiated with ancestors through ritual, careful burial, or cremation, and the grave goods with which a body was accompanied spoke of the life it had been and the position it would hold in memory. Burial practices varied as much as the tribes themselves. Some bodies were burned, and the ashes sealed in urns and placed in barrows. Others were inhumed in chambers beneath earthworks or beneath standing stones that marked a landscape with mnemonic punctuation. Objects interred with the dead, knives, combs, jewelry, were not mere goods but pointers to identity and belief. Offerings for the journey to another world that was often imagined as a mirror of life, but beyond earthly suffering. To walk a field and find a barrow was to read a page of long-closed history, each mound a faint heartbeat under turf. The landscape itself was curated by human hands as much as it was given by divine nature. Hedgerows separated fields and provided forage and shelter. Enclosures defined pastures and created boundaries that were both practical and symbolic. People pruned, planted, and cleared with the care of gardeners who knew the cost of soil loss and the value of a steady stream. This shaping of land created a cultural topography, lanes that led to specific groves, hollow ways worn by generations of feet, and landmarks that anchored narrative and property in equal measure. Weaving in the senses, art expressed belief and story in swirling lines and animal forms that suggested motion and transformation. The Latin art language wove continuous flow between people and animals, between human shape and unbounded pattern, hinting at a cosmology where life was less a set of rigid categories and more a conversation of forms. These motifs appeared on metal, on carved stone, and on wooden objects long since decayed, and they gave visual coherence to an identity that crossed tribal lines. When a brooch caught sunlight, it did more than shine. It broadcast origin and affiliation and the skill of the hand that made it. Music and poetry were carriers of memory and social technique. Bards and storytellers recited genealogies and heroic deeds in forms tuned to human memory, repetition, formulaic phrases, and rhythmic cadence that made law and history easier to hold in mind. Music accompanied work and ritual alike. Drums, horns, and stringed instruments made time palpable and created oral architecture in the space of feasting halls and open groves. Stories set patterns for behavior, illustrated consequences for bravery and hubris, and taught children the moral texture of their world through vivid example. Language itself was a living boundary, carrying names and place names that embed stories of origin in the very speech of the land. Personal names recalled ancestors, deities, and traits, and the retention of such names over generations was a way to keep a lineage visible. The spoken tradition made travel possible. Words carried reputation across distance, and an oral memory could travel farther and sustain longer than many written accounts in a world where writing was not ubiquitous. To know a name was to claim a place within a network of kin and obligation. Religious practice often folded the domestic into the cosmic. A household might maintain a shrine or a small tethered space within the home where offerings were left for protective spirits and ancestors. These domestic cults reinforced the larger rituals performed in communal groves and hill forts, creating a layered piety that made religion a constant background to daily chores. The presence of a carved figure or a small bowl left at a threshold was a humble, continuous act of communication with forces that knit the family to their past. Sacred animals and the symbolism attached to fauna were pervasive, with certain species taking on roles as omens, clan symbols, or embodiments of divine characteristics. The boar, for example, symbolized ferocity and might. Birds could be messengers of fate, seen as portents when they congregated or when their song changed. To understand a people is to watch which animals they revere and how they incorporate them into art and story, for symbols reveal how a community chooses to see itself reflected in the wider web of life. Some groves were associated with specific trees that had names and stories attached to them, an oak remembered for a bargain or a thorn for a lament. The relationship between people and such trees could be intimate, a final word spoken under a particular oak, a child tied to a branch by a ribbon to mark a vow, or a belt laid upon a bough as a petition for fertility. Those trees became living archives of memory, and the breaking of a sacred tree could produce consequences both social and spiritual as severe as any legal penalty. We must be careful when we speak of sacrifice, since the practice touches both rumor and reality in ancient accounts. Animals formed the bulk of offerings, sacrificed with ritual care and distributed in feasting and burial. Their meat was never purely waste, but part of a ritual economy. Reports of human sacrifice exist in classical sources and in some archaeological hints, but the scale and frequency are debated among scholars. It is safer to understand that sacrifices reflected a desire to bind human will to the exigencies of the land, the need for war victory, and the demands of fertility, framed by whatever cultural logic each tribe maintained. The notion of an otherworld was pervasive, although the specifics varied. This was a place that sometimes overlapped with the physical world, mounds and waters being thresholds, and sometimes stood wholly apart, an island or a hall where heroes feasted after death. The dead could be present, not as ghosts to be feared alone, but as members of a household whose advice had to be considered. Mediator figures could be the bridge between the living and this other domain. Such beliefs structured decisions about who received honor and how land and lineage would be remembered. Magic, in its many local forms, threaded through daily life. Cures and curses were part of a repertoire of techniques used to heal, bind, and protect. Charms and amulets were worn to protect against bad luck or to secure success in battle. The boundary between the empirical and the magical was porous. An herbal poultice might be effective because of an active compound or because social belief made it so. Ritual and medicine coexisted, not as opposition, but as two arms of the same effort to master an uncertain world. The sea and the coast imposed a different register of life, rhythm, and belief. Coastal tribes paid attention to tides and weather in a way highland people did not, and their vessels, clumsy yet seaworthy, traversed channels that linked communities and moved traders and warriors alike. Ship burials and coastal votives show a maritime spirituality that honored seafaring as both livelihood and symbol of dangerous passage. To be a coastal dweller was to be attuned to horizon and hazard, and the sea's unpredictability entered into song and prayer. Hill and valley, forest and fen, each environment shaped the variant cultures across Britain. The uplands fostered pastoralism, herds moving with the weather and sheltering in folds of land, while lowlands supported more intensive cereal agriculture and denser settlement. Mountains and bogs could be refuges for people, repositories for ritual deposition, and places where the margin between human settlement and wildness was sharply felt. In those differences, we see not isolation but adaptation, human ingenuity matched to local soil, stone, and water, producing a mosaic of practices and beliefs. Metalworking itself reshaped social possibility. The move from bronze to iron changed the dynamics of scarcity and access because iron ore was more widely available and required different techniques to smelt and forge. As iron tools became more common, agricultural productivity could increase, allowing for population growth and larger communities. At the same time, iron made weapons cheaper and more widespread, altering the balance of power and contributing to the emergence of warrior elites who controlled production and distribution of such goods. The sounds of a settlement, hammer on anvil, children at play, women singing as they weave, created a human chorus that made the place vivid long before formal records. Life was organized around cycles that were practical and ceremonial, and the soundscape was a form of social signal. A trumpet call might call an assembly just as a drummer might signal a ritual beginning. Music and noise stitched events into their proper sequence, and the human voice told the stories that anchored identity across time and place. Subscribe if you can almost hear the hammer, the songs, the voices, and want to join those who keep these stories alive. Architecture, though humble in materials, was imaginative and functional. Roundhouses fitted the circle of family life with a single hearth at the center where cooking began and storytelling extended into night. The rationality of building followed the needs of wind and rain, but it also encoded social arrangements. Who sat nearer to the fire spoke to rank and closeness, and the arrangement of household goods proclaimed the division of labor. To walk inside a roundhouse was to enter a world where the building itself supported the rhythm of domestic relation. Agriculture was a complex choreography of seed, soil, and season. People selected seeds for taste and resilience, moved animals to graze in a pattern that renewed pastures, and devised storage strategies that saw grain through long winters. The success of harvest structured demographic possibilities. A good harvest allowed for surpluses that could be given away as gifts or used to support craftsmen and warriors. Food storage, then, became a political tool as well as a matter of survival. The mood of ritual could be solemn and restrained, a prayer muttered into the root of an oak, or it could be spectacular, a public wonder of light and sound designed to rally a community behind a chieftain before they walked into battle. In either register, ritual was a way to order human action in relation to unseen forces and to provide moral outlines for how to behave. Even the most private devotions were part of a social grammar. What one family believed could ripple outward in times of crisis, convincing others to adopt practices that had proven useful in earlier seasons of hardship. Artisans taught apprentices through practice, not always through formal schools, and what was learned in the hand was more than technique, it was a craft of meaning. A young smith learned the temper of metal and the narrative of motifs, and in those motifs the world was expressed and transmitted. Craftsmanship thus became a language of continuity, where the skill of making became also the skill of remembering. Ritual specialists might specialize in different ways. Some were herbalists who knew seasonal gathering times and the toxic lookalikes of good plants. Others were judges who remembered the stories that settled disputes. And others were musicians or poets whose recitations maintained genealogies. The specialization of roles made communities resilient because knowledge was distributed in distinct centers rather than dependent on single figures. This social division of labor carried moral and practical value that modern eyes should not dismiss as primitive. Hearth and hall were theaters for the small dramas of daily life. The exchange of gifts at a feast could settle a debt, a woven belt could propose alliance, and a headstrong insult could seed decades of enmity that rumbled under the turf. People lived in immediate relation to their neighbors, and reputations were forged in clear public acts that could be nodded to in years hence. That visibility made social behavior manageable and enforceable without an overdeveloped bureaucracy. The psychological texture of honor and shame was fundamental. Public reputation mattered because it opened doors to trade, marriage, and alliance, and because it marked a person as trustworthy or not. Shame could be punishing in its social consequences and could ripple through households to affect children and kin, while honor could be an economic as well as moral asset. Managing honor required speech, courage, and investment in the networks that testified to one's reliability. Children were socialized through story, imitation, and initiation into work, learning through doing rather than abstract instruction. Play served as practice for adult skills and allowed younger members to rehearse social roles in a low-stakes environment. As they reached adolescence, rituals often marked their transition into adult duties, tests of endurance, public recognition, and sometimes symbolic acts that reoriented them from the household of childhood to the household of responsibility. These rites bound new adults into the obligations that maintained tribal cohesion. Food taboos and ritual prohibitions structured relationships, marking who could eat with whom and under what circumstances. Certain foods might be reserved for ritual use, or for the household of the chieftain, and abstentions could purify or distinguish a person in ceremonial contexts. Such rules were more than arbitrary, they regulated access to resources, reinforced social hierarchies, and created a language of respect that made communal life legible. Conflict settled not only on battlefields but in the subtler economies of gift exchange and reputation. A leader who gave generously displayed his ability to redistribute surplus and thus to maintain loyalty. A leader who hoarded withdrew political oxygen from his community. Gifts were not merely fancy tokens but practical reassignments of wealth that kept craftsmen working and warriors fed. In that economy, reciprocity bound people across the landscape like hidden ropes. Religion and politics were often braided together. A chieftain's claim to leadership was strengthened if he was seen as favored by the gods or as someone who maintained the proper rites and offerings. Patronage of the druids and the custodians of ritual could make or break a ruler in times of drought or plague, because public perception of divine favor mattered. The performance of rites was a form of governance, an assurance that the leader could act on behalf of both the living and the sacred realms. The ecology of sacred groves included human stewardship. People managed groves with techniques that balanced ritual seclusion with practical uses. A tree might be spared from felling because of its sanctity but pruned to promote fruiting or used as a marker around which livestock were corralled during certain times. This management shows a sophisticated interplay between reverence and use, a way of incorporating belief into the economy of survival. The sacred, therefore, was not simply prohibition but a managed relationship with nature that allowed humans to live within a costly landscape. Divination and omen reading were practical arts as much as superstitious indulgences. Observing birds in flight, the pattern of smoke, or the run of entrails might inform a leader's choice before setting out to war or choosing a path at a crossroads. Such practices framed uncertainty with rituals that made decision-making less random and more socially resonant. If the gods were consulted and signs read, then failure could be interpreted in the light of fate rather than simply human error. Divination thus provided narrative cover for risks that could not be removed by power alone. Some sacred spaces had architecture long after their wooden beginnings. Later generations might build stone markers where saplings had once stood, preserving the outline of an older ritual geography. Stone circles and standing stones could frame sightlines to solstices or act as memory anchors for places where more ephemeral rites had once been carried out. These monuments made the invisible visible, and they allowed future people to read a landscape shaped by innumerable past acts of devotion. Across centuries, those stones accumulated more meaning than any single generation could have anticipated. The role of charisma in leadership cannot be overstated. A successful chief combined administrative competence with charisma born of oratory, generosity, skill in arms, and sometimes an aura of religious sanction. Charismatic leaders attracted followers not solely through coercion but through the promise of protection and the hope of profit obtained in raids or through negotiated trade. Where charisma failed, coalition building through marriage and oath kept a polity intact until a new leader emerged. As communities grew denser, new pressures emerged. Soil exhaustion could force migration or demand crop rotation and fallow strategies more complex than earlier patterns. Population pressure could produce darker competition for meadows and pasture and force innovation in storage and transport. At the same time, densification could enable more elaborate craft specialization as stable markets made artisan goods more economically viable. Romantic visions often imagine these people as uniformly wild or consistently noble, and neither is accurate. They were, like all peoples, complex and pragmatic. They fought and loved, feared and aspired, and they turned to whatever means their culture provided to ensure survival and dignity. Their traditions were not static. Contact, conflict, and trade moved ideas and goods across boundaries so that adaptability was as much a defining attribute as tradition. These societies evolved in response both to internal needs and to the long reach of external pressures. Warfare had rhythms and etiquette that constrained violence in surprising ways. Raids often respected certain boundaries. Slaughter was not always the point, but seizing cattle, captives, or honor could be. Hostage-taking was a political device to secure peace as much as it was a coercive threat. The exchange of hostages bound families and polities together by personal ties that outlived the battle itself. Symbols like the torque or certain motifs on shield bosses acted like flags that a people could read at a glance. Such symbols carried compressed information about origin, allegiance, and status without any need for spoken explanation. On a battlefield or a hill, visual identity was crucial in preventing chaos. It made it possible to rally under a sign in the sudden heat of combat. Visual cultures thus functioned as both art and practical coordination. Seafaring required social arrangements to support it, boat-building knowledge, crews who could navigate, and shore communities that could supply food and materials. The ability to cross water changed the realm of possibility for a tribe, allowing for trade, plunder, migration, and the exchange of cultural forms. Those who lived by the sea acquired a worldview that included horizons and currents, a spatial imagination of distance and otherness that inland communities rarely had to entertain daily. Language and myth intertwined to create founding stories that justified claims to land and to honor. A clan might trace its root to a hero who wrested territory from a supernatural force or to a divine ancestor whose favor legitimized a ruling line. These narratives mattered because they made political claims sacred. A chieftain whose lineage derived from a hero had an argument of both memory and sacrality to present at assembly. Myth and law thus worked together, making memory into a political instrument. The archaeological record offers hints but not full scripts, and it is in the interstices between remains that imagination and inferential scholarship work together. Potsherds, post holes, and metalwork yield patterns of contact and craft, and those patterns suggest narratives of daily life that can be read carefully without overstretching evidence. Where written sources, often Roman, intrude, they bring outsider perspectives that must be contextualized against local material culture and later indigenous lore. Piecing these forms together requires humility and a willingness to hold multiple, sometimes contradictory pictures in mind. Markets and fairs provided crucial nodes for exchange and alliance. Periodic gatherings allowed people to trade surplus goods, to make marriages that cemented alliances, and to settle disputes in the presence of neutral parties. The market was a place of negotiation where reputations were polished and reputations destroyed, and political deals made that could redirect the fate of entire regions. Markets were thus a form of civic space that blended economic necessity with social theater. Ceremonial law could be spectacular. An oath might be sworn on sacred objects, or a chieftain might seal a bargain by performing a public act that made the agreement visible to all. Failure to hold to such an oath could result in excommunication from trade networks or in the sanction of the wider community, which in a society dependent on mutual cooperation could be ruinous. The social enforcement of law relied on shared understandings and the fear of being cut from the webs of obligation that sustained life. Healing practices blended plant knowledge and ritual. A potion might be mixed while a charm was chanted, and the performance itself could matter as much as the active ingredient. Herbalism developed through close observation, which plants thrived where, which caused sickness, and which soothed symptoms of fever or pain. Those who mastered such knowledge were highly valued, and their skills were transmitted through apprenticeship and family tradition. The child's play that rehearsed adult life was also a form of cultural transmission. Boys and girls imitated craft, battled with sticks, and learned the rhythms of speech and story that would become their tools in adulthood. These games taught coordination, memory, and the rudiments of social competition and cooperation in forms that were immediate and engaging. Play thus did the vital work of preparing new generations to inherit the rituals and the burdens of social life. Ritual specialists' expertise in calendrical knowledge mattered greatly because timing could be everything in agricultural societies. Knowing when to sow or when to slaughter required observation and memory passed down through ritual experts who could read the sky, the soil, and the behavior of animals. Calendrical rites linked human action to cosmic cycles and thus made practical skills like planting into acts of sacred timing. Time, regulated ritually, became a resource managed for the community's good. Canoes and boats were extensions of the body and of technology. A man who knew the sound of seas could read wind and cloud as a shepherd reads the pastures. Boat building relied on shared labor, on stout oak timbers, and on the knowledge of which joints survived wet conditions best. The sea demanded a kind of stoicism. Sailors accepted risk as the price of trade and movement, and their fates entered household memory like the names of fallen kin who had gone to water and never returned. The construction and use of burial mounds and stone monuments involved communal labor that in itself reinforced social ties. Gathering people to lift stones, to build cairns, or to mound earth over a chamber demanded coordination and reciprocity. These acts created the very social glue that monuments later symbolized. In the act of constructing a monument, a community performed an investment in its continuity, producing a geography of memory that would outlive individual lives. Such projects strengthened the mesh of relationships that defined social life. Dances and festivals performed social roles as effectively as any assembly. They allowed for the negotiation of marriage contracts, the display of strength, and the reenactment of mythic narratives that taught caution and courage. The body became a medium of social message, a step, a gesture. The showing of a wound healed in a previous raid could perform reputational claims. Festivals thus condensed politics and poetry into moments that reshaped community feeling. Clothing and ornaments signaled more than fashion, they encoded the story of a person's life. The brooch that fastened a cloak might have been a grandmother's, the pattern on a tunic could indicate a fosterage bond, and the tartan of a people, though often associated with later centuries, echoes the reality that woven patterning can declare kin and region. Such material culture was durable memory. Objects carried human history in a tactile, portable form. Cultural conservatism coexisted with flexibility. Long-standing patterns of ritual remained stable because they secured intergenerational trust, but adaptation to new tools, crops, and stories was constant. When new trade goods arrived, they were integrated into ritual forms and social display. When conflict reshaped alliances, marriage patterns and gift exchanges changed in response. This dynamic balance allowed these societies to maintain identity without resisting the innovations that could alleviate hardship. Storms, droughts, and plague were always close to the surface of life and made religious observance urgent. In times of extreme stress, leaders turned to ritual experts for signs of the gods' displeasure, making sacrifices that could be communal expressions of supplication. Public acts during calamity served social as well as spiritual functions. They rallied people, organized resources, and created a narrative that the crisis had been acknowledged and addressed. Ritual thus functioned as crisis management as well as piety. The sense of identity in tribal kingdoms included hostility and generosity in equal measure. Tribes could be fierce rivals one season and trading partners the next. Their identity was relational and negotiated at every turn. Alliances shifted through marriage, oath, and the charisma of leaders, and whole polities could reconfigure across a generation. Such fluidity made the political world lively and often dangerous, and it required skillful diplomacy as well as courage in arms. Naming rights and genealogies mattered because they linked the living to a sequence of predecessors and because land claims were often justified by descent. The recitation of lineage in public contexts functioned as a legal claim as much as it was a story. To remember your ancestors was to assert your right to fields and to the companionable regard of neighbors. Memory, therefore, became evidence in an oral law culture, and those who could recite the right names held power beyond the physical strengths they possessed. The presence of fortifications and shifting population centers tells us about the pressures these societies faced. Defensive works were responses to both external raids and to internal competition for scarce resources, but they were also statements of permanence, claiming the landscape with earth and labor. Where fortifications concentrated, so did craft and wealth, and those centers of power attracted attention from both neighbors and aspiring rulers. We must be careful not to romanticize violent acts. Raids were costly and destructive for everyone involved, and violence often created cycles of retribution that could last generations. Yet fighting also created renown, redistributed resources, and could be a pragmatic means of survival in a world where authority was personal and mutable. Warrior prestige was therefore a double-edged sword. It kept the leader's household fed but also risked provoking escalations that could doom a community. The ritual of oath and vow was central because promises bound people across time in ways that were enforceable by communal memory. An oath sworn in a sacred grove or before a crowd had moral weight because the community could recall the ancient and hold the oathbreaker to account. These public vows made social promises visible and thus politically potent, ensuring that personal integrity had public consequence. In moments of peace, the exchange of stories and the performance of craft created cultural cohesion that outlived any generational skirmish. Children grew into adults who would inherit the accumulated technique of weaving, metalwork, and the narrative repertoire of their people. This ongoing transmission ensured continuity even as the surface of politics fluctuated, preserving a culture's core rhythms in the hum of everyday work. The archetype of the warrior poet encapsulates an important cultural ideal, strength tempered by eloquence and memory. A true leader could not be merely forceful, he or she had to be persuasive in counsel and able to anchor claims in story and ritual. This dual expectation shaped the education of leaders through memory training, legal recitations, and exposure to the arts of persuasion. Oratory was a form of armament as effective in some settings as any spear or sword. Craft guilds were informal but vital networks of mutual aid and training, ensuring the continuity of knowledge across generations. A young smith's success depended on the willingness of a master to teach and on the patronage of a household that could provide resources and commissions. Such social economies operated without strict formalization but with deep obligation. The cut of a brooch or the temper of a sword were signatures of both skill and social connection. As the centuries passed, contact with Romans and other neighbors changed the balance of power and introduced new technologies and organizational forms. Some tribes adapted by adopting foreign goods and practices, others resisted, and still others negotiated hybrid identities that mixed local ritual with imported techniques. These encounters reshaped social possibilities and sometimes accelerated the formation of larger polities that resembled kingdoms more than loose tribal federations. Religion adjusted to contact as well, sometimes accommodating foreign gods or interpreting them through local cosmologies. The presence of Roman deities and inscriptions in Britain later on testifies to syncretism. Local gods might be equated with foreign ones in order to make sense of new religious vocabulary. This interpretive flexibility allowed communities to integrate new forms of worship without abandoning the structures that reinforced social life. Iconography evolved as objects met foreign tastes. Metalwork sometimes adopted new motifs, and techniques such as enameling or new alloy recipes changed the look of ornament, but local artisans often reinterpreted these influences through their own iconographic vocabulary. The result was a hybridization. Some objects looked outward, and others looked inward, and this mixture became a hallmark of adaptive identity. Migration and population movement were part of the long story. Incoming peoples altered linguistic and cultural landscapes, and the exchange of genes matched the exchange of goods. The map of tribal kingdoms changed as people moved across regions, bringing new practices and sometimes establishing dominance in fresh territories. These movements were rarely simple conquests. They were complex processes of assimilation and resistance that remade the social map over generations. The persistence of sacred groves into later centuries shows the tenacity of certain beliefs and practices, even when political structures shifted. Trees that had been venerated for centuries continued to acquire stories, and the ritual topography of a place could survive multiple political regimes. That endurance reminds us that spiritual geography and daily life are tightly entangled. To lose a grove was to lose a line in the book of communal memory. Seasonal festivals remained anchors even as external pressure changed the political scene. Beltane and Samhain-like festivities adapted to local needs, marking transitions that mattered for safety, marriage, and the regulation of livestock. These festivals gave structure to a year's labor and made communal rhythms visible, anchoring social life in cyclical acts of renewal and remembrance. The resilience of oral tradition ensured that even where written records are sparse, stories persisted, sometimes changing in detail but maintaining core structures that told people who they were. These stories were not static, they were living texts configured in performance, and their adaptability made them fit new contexts while preserving continuity. Listening to them in a hall or in a grove, a community refreshed its sense of origin, purpose, and obligation. The skillful use of landscape as a memory device was a social technology. People literally inscribed their stories into place. Standing stones, barrows, and tree-marked paths acted as mnemonic anchors that allowed reciters to unfold genealogies and narratives with the land themselves serving as prompts. This integration of story and place made communal memory durable in the absence of abundant writing, and it created a geography of identity that could be read by those trained to see. Ultimately, the world of ancient British tribal kingdoms was a weave of necessities and aesthetics, politics and prayer, craft and courage. Warriors and priests, farmers and smiths, women and children all participated in a living tapestry where each act, whether the forging of a sword or the binding of a child's hair, spoke to the larger story of survival and meaning. In that weave, sacred groves retained their voice, and memory was the quiet engine that kept society moving from season to season and generation to generation. To drive across a modern countryside is to pass over traces of this world, barrows under pasture, lines that might mark an ancient droveway, place names that carry the echo of a personal name recorded in a treaty or saga fragment. If you slow your mind and listen as you travel, you might hear the distant hum of those lives, the ring of the smith's hammer, a chorus of children's play alongside the hedge, and the low, persistent presence of the grove, holding secrets and promises in its wood. That continuity is perhaps the most remarkable thing of all, how human communities find forms that survive, adapt, and speak to us long after the hands that shaped them are gone. Long before Rome's eagles appeared on the horizon, the island we now call Britain was a patchwork of tribal kingdoms, each with its own rhythms, stories, and stakes. People lived in hill forts and lowland settlements, tended fields and herds, remembered their dead with care, and traded beyond the sea with neighbors in Gaul and across the continent. They spoke related languages we lump together as Celtic, but words and customs varied from one river valley to the next, and loyalty often ran to a local ruler rather than to any distant nation. When the first Roman ships carved arcs across the Channel in the middle decades of the 1st century BC, they met not a unified nation but a shifting landscape of alliances, rivalries, and ambitions. Some tribal leaders saw Rome as an opportunity, a source of exotic goods, coin, and prestige that could be woven into existing power structures. Others read Rome as a threat, a force that might sweep away older ways, and fold kingdoms under foreign banners, and demand new taxes and obedience. Julius Caesar's two expeditions in 55 and 54 BC were exploratory raids that changed perceptions more than territories. He came with curiosity and with the eye of a strategist, making treaties with local rulers, taking chieftains as hostages, and demonstrating that the mighty armies of Rome could cross the sea. Caesar returned to Gaul claiming victory and knowledge, and the idea that Britain could be reached, and might be conquered, entered Roman imagination in a way it had not before. The generations that followed did not rush to conquer. Instead, Britain became part of a diplomatic map. Some kings cultivated Roman connections, accepting gifts and trade for loyalty and sometimes adopting Roman customs. Others, like the powerful Cativalonian house in the southeast, consolidated power within the island itself, rivaling Roman influence and producing leaders who could both fight and bargain with Mediterranean powers. Then in AD 43, the political moment in Rome opened a door Britain could not ignore. Emperor Claudius, who had his own reasons for a successful military campaign, ordered an invasion that was pitched as an imperial triumph. It was not a blind assault of infinite troops, but a carefully staged effort that combined legions, auxiliary forces, and the involvement of local allies who sought advantage in a new order. The initial Roman advance was swift in places, measured in others. Armies moved along river routes and across lowland plains, subduing or negotiating with tribes as they went, deposing hostile rulers, and installing client kings where that served Roman aims. The tide of conquest was both a military effort and a political project. Governors, legates, and bureaucrats followed soldiers to create structures of taxation, law, and supply. Yet Rome met resistance almost at once. In the west and north, kingdoms such as the Silures of South Wales and the Ordovices of Mid Wales offered fierce opposition, using mountainous ground to frustrate Roman formations. In the Thames Valley, a boy named Caratacus would become a symbol of stubborn resistance, knitting together allies and fighting in a way that tested Roman patience and capability. Caratacus's name echoes in the records because his resistance lasted and because he was captured and brought to Rome, where he made a speech that reportedly persuaded the emperor of his dignity and allowed him to live. That episode reveals a complex reality. Conquerors and conquered were not pure enemies. They negotiated honor, status, and survival in ways that often blurred the line between domination and accommodation. Caratacus's struggle mattered, but so did the ways local elites adapted to new circumstances. The most dramatic rebellion, however, came not from the hills but from a woman whose rage echoed through the empire. Boudica, queen of the Iceni, rose after abuses by Roman officials and soldiers became intolerable, after property was pillaged and daughters were violated. She fused a coalition of lesser tribes around her indignation and strategic purpose, and for a time her revolt seemed unstoppable. Boudica's forces struck at Roman settlements in quick, brutal fashion, burning towns and slaying residents while leaving a vivid imprint on memory. London was burnt, Colchester and St. Albans suffered, and the response by Roman forces under Suetonius Paulinus had to be measured and ruthless to restore order. Her rebellion was crushed, and Boudica's end is told in multiple versions, but the significance lies in what the revolt revealed about Roman rule. Abuses provoked profound backlash, and imperial control had limits. After suppression of Boudica's uprising, Rome did not simply tighten the screws and carry on. There followed periods of reconstruction, negotiation, and a concerted effort to integrate local elites while maintaining military dominance where it was necessary. Roman governors and administrators built forts and roads, established civitates, administrative towns, or recognized existing native settlements as seats of authority, and used a mix of force and patronage to stabilize the province. This process of Romanization, as historians call it, was not uniform or total. In some areas, especially in the south and east, the landscape changed dramatically. Villas appeared on former farmsteads, towns developed markets and baths, pottery kilns turned out ware stamped with Roman styles, and Latin became the language of administration and commerce. In other regions, the old ways persisted visibly. Roundhouses, ritual places, and local forms of dress and speech continued for generations. The Roman army was central to this transformation and to continued unrest. Legions were stationed in key places and fortified with a network of roads that served both military and economic purposes. Auxiliary troops, recruited from across the empire and locally as well, patrolled and policed, bringing new skills and raising questions of loyalty. Forts dotted the landscape like beacons, And when the army moved, local economies adjusted to supply and service the troops. Yet resistance never vanished entirely. In Wales and Western Britain, formidable campaigns were needed repeatedly to pacify tribes that used terrain to their advantage. Leaders such as Caratacus had been skilled at blending guerrilla methods with larger-scale battles, and those tactics did not disappear when Roman discipline inserted itself into daily life. The hills and marshes were refuges for insurgents and for traditions that the Romans found hard to uproot. The north presented its own set of challenges. Beyond the line of Roman control lay tribes who preferred to be called free and who raided into the province from time to time. The Romans, to secure their northerly gains and to protect the heartlands, built linear defenses, most famously Hadrian's Wall, and later the Antonine Wall further north in an attempt to push the frontier. These walls were not just military barriers but statements about where the empire would stop and where it would not. Hadrian's Wall, in its stone and turf, was more than a fortification. It organized the border and the lives of people who settled beside it. A mile castle here, a fort there, small settlements grew up providing services and goods to soldiers. Tablets and inscriptions from Vindolanda and housesteads tell us human things: letters home, shopping lists, requests for warm underwear, and the everyday weaving of lives under empire. The Roman presence reshaped agriculture, industry, and trade. The introduction of new crops, new breeding methods, and Roman-style field systems increased production in many areas, and villas became centers of agricultural innovation and wealth for a landed class. Mining expanded under Roman direction, and metalwork, iron, lead, tin, fed both local needs and long-distance markets. Ports and riverways carried goods to the continent, coin flowed in, and with it came new ideas about value and exchange. This economic change also produced shifts in social status and identity. Local elites who cooperated with Rome could gain titles, citizenship, and wealth, while others lost ground. Some people moved to towns to pursue trade and crafts, while others remained tied to land. The line between Roman and native blurred because being Roman meant adopting certain practices, dress, architecture, legal forms, and those practices were attractive to many for the power they conferred. Religion, too, became a landscape of mixing and adaptation. The native pantheon did not vanish. Celtic gods persisted, took Roman names, or were identified with Roman deities in a process called interpretatio Romana. Temples to the imperial cult appeared alongside shrines to older gods, and votive offerings show a mingling of rituals. In private households, people worshipped ancestors and local spirits even as they invoked Roman protectors for harvests, ships, or the health of a legionary. Material culture reflects this blending. Brooches with native motifs sit beside imported glass, local potters mimic Roman shapes, and jewelry mixes Celtic designs with Mediterranean techniques. Fishbourne Palace, near Chichester, stands as a vivid example of wealthy local patronage of Roman forms. Mosaics, formal gardens, and imported marbles show an island elite invested in Mediterranean taste. At the same time, many towns display layouts that adapted to local conditions, with marketplaces and fortifications that spoke to older priorities. Language shifted too. Latin became important in official life, in law, and in commerce, but it did not instantly replace the native tongues that most people used at home. Bilingualism likely became common in urban centers, military towns, and among the educated elite, while rural areas retained Celtic speech for generations. Inscriptions show Latin carved into stone, but the speech of daily life likely remained a patchwork of dialects for centuries. Roman law and administration introduced new forms of governance. Land surveys, tax records, and municipal councils modeled on Roman institutions created pathways for local participation in provincial government. Towns had magistrates, councils, and public works that connected them to wider provincial structures. At the same time, some aspects of customary law persisted. Community practices and kinship networks continued to matter in disputes and inheritance. Military service became a social ladder for some. Auxiliaries recruited from Britain served across the empire, learned military craft, and sometimes received Roman citizenship after 25 years of service. These soldiers came home with new skills, pensions, and perspectives that could reshape their places of origin. Veterans received land grants in frontier zones and sometimes settled in the very communities they had once pacified. Archaeology provides the texture of these transformations in ways written records alone cannot. Excavations at towns like Verulamium and Silchester reveal street patterns, markets, and domestic life. Villa sites uncover mosaics and underfloor heating, forts yield barracks, command buildings, and personal correspondence. Finds such as the Vindolanda tablets give a voice to individuals, wives writing to husbands, soldiers requesting socks, suppliers noting deliveries, and remind us that large processes were lived in everyday details. While Roman influence grew, it was not an uninterrupted story of success. In the 2nd century AD, local revolts flared up, and the province required repeated military attention. The Brigantes in the north, for example, were sometimes allies and sometimes antagonists, and their internal factions complicated Roman plans. The ebb and flow of control meant that Romans had to balance garrisons, diplomatic marriages, and local power plays in order to keep the province functioning. Civic life in towns introduced new rhythms of time and culture. Public baths became centers of social life, amphitheaters staged spectacles or civic gatherings, and forums served as hubs for business and rhetoric. For many residents, especially those of higher status, participating in such institutions signified a newly acquired identity. Yet these towns were embedded in landscapes shaped by older customs, and so rituals persisted that retained older meanings even as new forms were adopted. Trade networks expanded in ways that touched ordinary lives. Imported wine and olive oil moved north with roads and ships, and their presence at table was a symbol of status. Local products found new markets, including pottery styles that spread across the province. Maritime links with Gaul and the continent were vital, and port towns became cosmopolitan nodes where ideas and goods coursed through the island. Education and literacy increased in some circles because Roman administration required record-keeping and communication. Schools of a sort appeared, and the ability to read and write in Latin or Greek opened careers in bureaucracy and trade. Yet literacy was not universal. It remained the province of the elite, merchants, and clergy for many generations, even as more inscriptions and graffiti appear on stone, pottery, and portable objects. Religion in the later Roman period also introduced Christianity, which arrived gradually and unevenly. Early communities may have formed in urban centers and among veterans, and by the 4th century Christianity had become a significant presence in some parts of Britain. The process was patchy. In some localities, pagan and Christian practices coexisted, while in others new churches and bishops began to organize communities in ways that would shape post-Roman identities. The fortress system, roadways, and administrative networks bound Britain to continental imperial systems, but they also made the province dependent on the rhythms of empire. When Rome faced crises elsewhere, barbarian invasions, fiscal difficulties, or political instability, the security of Britain could be threatened. Governors sometimes diverted resources, and the legions that protected the island could be pulled into wider imperial conflicts. By the late 3rd and 4th centuries, signs of strain became more visible. Fortifications were rebuilt, new kinds of military responses were launched, and the imperial center changed how it related to outlying provinces. Emperors and usurpers rose and fell in quick succession, and in times of doubt, central authority wavered. Britain, as a distant province, felt the tremors of these larger imperial anxieties. Economic patterns shifted as well. Coin shortages, debasement, and disruptions in trade affected agriculture and urban life. Local economies adapted through barter, local coinage, and regional exchange that could compensate for disruptions at the imperial level. In some areas, towns declined while rural estates consolidated, changing the face of the land in a way that prefigured later centuries. Cultural memory of Rome took multiple forms in the centuries that followed. Some communities clung to Roman names, law forms, and architectural ruins as part of identity and continuity. Others remembered Rome as an occupying power whose withdrawal opened space for new social arrangements. The memory of Roman roads and forts carried practical uses, as their masonry and lines were reused in later construction and travel. The breaking point for Roman administration in Britain did not happen overnight. As Roman central power faded in the early 5th century, official structures frayed, legions were recalled or disbanded, financial links with Italy weakened, and local leaders were left to manage as best they could. In some places, local government continued under Roman forms for a time, in others new rulers and warlords emerged, claiming power in the vacuum left behind. The end of formal Roman rule affected everyone differently. For urban elites who had built their lives around Roman institutions, the withdrawal could mean loss of status and security. For smallholders and rural families, it could mean shifting allegiances and new threats from raiders. The collapse of central funding for public works led to gradual decay in many towns, while rural estates sometimes adapted to local needs more readily. Into this complicated aftermath stepped new pressures from the east and south. Germanic groups, Anglo-Saxons, began to settle and raid, joining a patchwork of migrations and power struggles that would eventually reshape the island. The memory and infrastructure of Roman Britain did not disappear instantly. Instead, it was folded into new polities and cultural mixes, and the Roman past remained a resource for claimants to power as much as it was a wound from occupation. Yet beneath the turmoil there were resilient continuities. Some Roman roads remained key arteries of travel and trade, villas sometimes remained in use or were reoccupied, and local elites who had adapted to Roman rule continued to exercise influence in new forms. The persistence of Latin and ecclesiastical contexts, and the continued veneration of some saints and religious practices with Roman connections, help explain how Roman cultural traces lasted long after imperial troops departed. Archaeological revelations have deepened our understanding of these transitions. Excavations show both continuity and collapse. They demonstrate how people repurposed Roman structures and how ceramic typologies evolved as trade networks shifted. Studying burial practices and settlement patterns reveals shifting beliefs and economies, and island-wide surveys give us a clearer picture of how different regions followed different trajectories. To listen to the story of Roman arrival and British response is to hear both clash and conversation. The initial military confrontations, of which Caesar's visits, Claudius's invasion, Caratacus's resistance, and Boudicca's rebellion are the most famous examples, are dramatic. They are also only the opening acts in a much longer play of accommodation, conversion, and adaptation that changed the island's language, landscape, and institutions over centuries. In the South, Roman influence wove itself into everyday life, turning some places into hubs of Romanized culture where mosaics and baths were ordinary features. In the West and North, Roman power was a more contested presence, and local identity remained robust, often fused with selective adoption of Roman practices. These regional differences mattered because they shaped later medieval polities and the cultural map that emerged after Rome's rule ended. Examining the Roman military's presence in Britain teaches us about daily life in the province. Soldiers came from across the empire, Syria, Spain, North Africa, and their lives intersected with natives in markets, marriages, and friendships. Auxiliary regiments that had been stationed in Britain could reflect a cosmopolitan blend of cultures within the army itself, and their duties included policing and engineering as well as fighting. The technical skill of Roman engineering changed how the landscape could be traversed and used. Roads built with careful slopes and drainage allowed for faster travel, moving soldiers and goods through landscapes that previously had been harder to traverse. Bridges, drainage systems, and harbors improved trade and communication, and the physicality of Roman engineering left marks still visible in place names and topography. Forts and fortifications, besides being military structures, often became nuclei for rural settlement. Civilian communities sprang up outside forts to serve soldiers with food, clothing, and leisure, and these vicus settlements could become lasting centers. Potteries, smithies, and bakeries anchored these communities economically, and their remains give us a sense of the everyday commerce that kept an empire functioning at the local level. The Roman diet left a mark too. Introductions such as new kinds of wheat, the popularity of bread ovens, and the presence of imports like olive oil and fish sauce changed culinary habits for some. But food preferences varied by status and region. Wealthy urban households enjoyed imported delicacies while rural families remained rooted in traditional staples. The archaeological record of bones, seeds, and residues tells a story of both change and persistence, serving as a culinary mirror of cultural contact. Art and symbolism conveyed status and identity. Mosaics celebrated mythic themes and local patrons, statues commemorated emperors and benefactors, and household objects bore the marks of taste and connection. Local craftsmen adopted Roman motifs, and in doing so they created hybrid artistic traditions that were distinctively provincial, Roman in technique, local in flavor. Economic regulation tightened under Roman rule through standardized coinage and taxation, which made the province legible to imperial authorities. Coin hoards found across Britain indicate savings, emergency concealment, or ritual deposits, and their composition helps date changing patterns of stability and unrest. The presence of coins bearing imperial images also played a role in the propagation of imperial ideology and in the daily exchange economy. The legal structures introduced by Rome offered new kinds of redress and property rights. For those who embraced Roman law, the courts and legal frameworks could offer predictability and access to imperial protections. But customary law retained its force in many areas, and the legal pluralism of Roman Britain accommodated both formal legalities and traditional resolution practices. When looking at the material culture of religion, we find altars to local deities inscribed with Latin dedications, votive offerings placed in springs and wells, and monumental temples that combined native styles with Roman order. The cult of the emperor coexisted uneasily with local loyalties, and the role of religion in daily life shifted along with political realities. The emergence of Christianity later complicated the religious landscape further, adding new institutions and literate traditions. The island's coastline became a map of ports, fortified promontories, and trading hubs that linked Britain with the wider world. Merchant ships arrived from Gaul, from the Rhineland, and from Mediterranean harbors carrying luxury goods and returning with commodities. The movement of people and ideas by sea magnified changes inland and created networks of exchange that connected local producers to continental markets. In the north, the Roman presence was always more precarious, and campaigns were episodic and costly. Attempts to subdue Caledonian tribes beyond Hadrian's Wall produced cycles of attack, retreat, and fortification. Roman strategy oscillated between expansion and consolidation, reflecting the difficulties of projecting power across rugged terrain and among populations determined to maintain independence. The construction of Hadrian's Wall itself speaks to a new kind of imperial policy. Instead of continuous expansion, Rome drew a line and sought to control movement, revenue, and military logistics. The wall became a diplomatic instrument as much as a military one, registering who moved goods and people across the imperial border. Customs, duties, and inspections at gatehouses formed part of a broader system of frontier management. Culturally, the presence of the army and the town drew pragmatic adaptations into daily life. Names changed, fashions shifted, and the language of power, Latin, infused local rhetoric. Yet beneath the veneer of Romanization, the deep-rooted customs of kinship, landholding, and ritual practice kept the social fabric intact. Being Roman could be as much an outward performance as a lived identity, especially in provincial contexts. The story of Roman Britain is also a story of uneven prosperity. While some elites accumulated wealth and invested in villas and urban life, many people remained tied to subsistence economies or localized markets. The gap between a wealthy villa owner and a small farmer could be wide, and that inequality sometimes fueled unrest or migration. Social mobility existed, but its pathways were shaped by service, marriage, and political patronage just as much as by trade and inheritance. The martial culture that underpinned Roman power generated its own economy of demand. Weapons, shoes, uniforms, and food supplies were continuous needs that supported specialized craft and trade. Dealers and contractors profited by provisioning the army, and local makers learned to produce styles suitable for Roman tastes. The convergence of military, economic, and administrative demands created networks that Atlantic-era Britain had not needed before Rome's arrival. Education in the Roman sense brought literacy, rhetoric, and law into local elites' training, and those educated in Latin could claim a special place in municipal and imperial life. Their letters, inscriptions, and dedications survived in stone and in rare parchment to show a world where learning mattered. The reach of such education was limited, but where it existed it created different options and identities for those who could grasp them. The Roman provincial elite also sponsored public works that shaped urban life. Drainage systems, temples, and forums enhanced civic pride and practical living. Civic patrons used building projects to advertise their status and to bind communities to imperial architectures of authority. Such investments were part of the social reciprocity that anchored Roman towns. Patrons gave, and the community acknowledged them with status. Across the province, women played roles that were crucial but often underrepresented in the written sources. They managed households, oversaw estates, and sometimes took public religious roles as priestesses or benefactors. Some elite women displayed power through building dedications and portraits, while ordinary women ensured continuity through domestic skills and social networks that sustained communities. Craft production in Roman Britain was both specialized and local. Potters, metalworkers, weavers, and leatherworkers developed skills honed to supply urban and military markets. Workshops clustered around towns and forts, and their output, some local, some imitative of continental styles, testifies to the adaptive nature of provincial economies. The end of Roman rule threw cities into uncertainty but did not erase them overnight. Some towns retained a degree of life, acting as market centers for surrounding countryside, while others declined into ruin. The urban skeleton left behind, walls, baths, and basilicas, sometimes provided shelter and identity for successor communities, and sometimes stones from Roman buildings were taken up and reused in new constructions. Medicine and public health under Roman influence improved in some respects through improved sanitation, baths, and an emphasis on urban engineering. But many illnesses remained endemic, and medical practices were a mix of classical theory, local remedies, and ritual healing. The archaeological record of medical instruments and the remains of hospitals for soldiers reveal a concern for health that linked military readiness to the well-being of communities. The imperial bureaucracy's reach extended into daily life through taxation, record-keeping, and law, but it also produced paperwork and personal records that now survive in fragments. Tax lists, military rolls, and legal cases, when we find them, reveal a society organized by record and regulation. The administrative ability to transform local practices into provincial policy was both a source of stability and a strain when resources were scarce. Seasonal cycles and ecological knowledge remained central to the lives of most inhabitants. Farming calendars, harvest rituals, and the management of grazing lands dictated much of human activity. Roman agricultural knowledge offered technical improvements, but environmental constraints and local practice continued to shape the rhythm of rural life. Over time, the island's identity evolved into a complex tapestry of Roman, native, and migratory threads. The adoption of Roman ways among some communities did not erase older loyalties, rather it produced multi-layered identities. The men and women of Britain navigated these layers as they married, farmed, and worshipped, choosing selectively which Roman elements to keep and which native customs to preserve. The memory of Roman Britain became a tool for later rulers too. Medieval kings and chroniclers often invoked Roman law, ruins, and lineage as evidence of ancient prestige. The Roman past was not just archaeology, it became myth and authority, used to legitimize claims and to measure cultural change in subsequent centuries. Even as Rome retreated from Britain, the island's connections to Europe did not vanish. Trade, migration, and diplomatic contact continued in varying degrees, and Britain remained part of a network that stretched into the Mediterranean and beyond. The echoes of Roman institutions, roads, towns, and legal habit provided a scaffold upon which new societies would arise. In the centuries that followed Rome's absence, the British landscape would be reshaped again by new peoples and ideas, but always with Roman traces underfoot. The physical monuments, the road lines, and the cultural memories laid down during the Roman centuries provided resources for later builders and rulers. Understanding this layered history helps explain not only the Roman effect on Britain but also the resilience of older practices that survived under imperial shadow. To listen to these centuries is to register complexity, conquest and negotiation, violence and patronage, imposition and adaptation. The arrival of Rome was a catalyst that accelerated some changes while forcing others into deep conservation. People did not simply surrender to an imperial wave, they met it with resistance sometimes, with accommodation often, and with a stubborn endurance of their own traditions. At the heart of the story are individuals, soldiers who wrote letters from cold forts, women who managed household economies and dedicated altars, farmers who adjusted crops and field systems, and rulers who married or fought Roman governors for the sake of survival. Collectively, they produced a provincial culture that was neither purely Roman nor purely native, but a distinctive synthesis that would shape the island for centuries. Archaeology and historical texts join to give us a fuller picture: coins that tell of imperial images and local economies, tablets that reveal personal voice, and ruins that show the scale of ambition and decline. Each new excavation, each new analysis of a pottery shard or chemical residue, adds detail to a living picture of contact, conflict, and cultural fusion. The story is alive because our knowledge and interpretations continue to evolve. The arrival of Rome, then, is not a single dramatic event but a drawn-out process of intrusion, reaction, and mutual influence. It reshaped power, language, faith, and landscape in ways that were sometimes immediate and sometimes generational. To understand this process is to appreciate how humans adapt to empire, with pragmatism, with resistance, and with creativity. Even now, the remnants of Roman Britain, walls half buried in fields, mosaics under modern houses, inscriptions carved into stone, invite us to imagine the lives that once inhabited them. Standing amid such ruins, we can sense how people negotiated identity and authority in daily life, how they balanced new opportunities with old loyalties, and how empire could be both inhibitor and enabler of local transformation. The legacy of those centuries is not merely archaeological. It also lives on in linguistic traces, in law and place names, and in stories that medieval chroniclers later reshaped into legends. Britain after Rome was born into a world already altered by centuries of contact. New polities would draw on the memory of Roman organization as they sought to build authority in a shifting political landscape. In the end, the tale of Rome's arrival in Britain is a human story. It is about ambition and survival, about the stubbornness of culture and the allure of power, about the ways ordinary lives intersect with extraordinary events. It is also a reminder that history is rarely a straight line. It is an accretion of choices, resistances, adaptations, and reinterpretations that together create the world we inherit. And so we keep listening, through stones and shards, through letters and coins, through the careful work of scholars and the vivid imagination of storytellers. Because the story of Roman Britain continues to unfold as we discover more about the people who lived through the arrival of an empire and made of that arrival something new, contested, and profoundly human. When the imperial tricolor was folded and carried away from these islands, the world that had known Rome did not vanish overnight. The roads remained, the walls stood, and the people who had lived under Roman rule kept breathing, farming, bargaining, and burying their dead. In the dimming light, the familiar forms of towns and forts became points of reference for new leaders, and the memory of empire became a frame through which survival was imagined. What followed was not a single collapse, but a long rearrangement, a series of local decisions that remade landscapes and loyalties into something new and recognizable as the medieval world to come. The first shock was practical. Roman legions no longer patrolled the frontiers, and the administrative machinery that had organized taxes, grain distribution, and building work slowed and then stopped. Local magnates found themselves in possession of authority they had often only held temporarily, and they began to turn that administrative residue into personal power. At the same time, ordinary people adapted their daily lives, continuing to till, raise livestock, and exploit pastures while paying heed to whichever lord could protect their fields and hearths. Underneath the politics lay continuities that could be overlooked. Roads and bridges, built with manpower and stone that remembered imperial engineering, remained routes of commerce and communication. Villas and towns, though many declined, were not all abandoned. Some were transformed into centers of new lordship, while others shrank and receded into the countryside. When you listen to the pattern of earthworks and pottery shards, you hear a continuity of human presence rather than a clean break. This period was not dominated only by descent into chaos. It was a time of adaptation that involved reuse and reinvention. Hill forts that had been silent for centuries were refurbished, not as throwbacks but as practical responses to new threats. People reused Roman masonry in houses, churches, and defensive works, and their hands reshaped imperial stone into local habitations and sacred spaces. To understand the human faces of this change, we look to names written in the pages of monks and chroniclers, and to words chiseled on stone. Writers like Gildas offered a moral picture of decline and blame, while later chroniclers shaped history into lessons and legends. Their accounts are colored by personal viewpoints, but they preserve echoes of real events, sieges and migrations, alliances struck by marriage, and the everyday juridical wrangling that held communities together. Language itself evolved as communities adapted. The Britons spoke a Celtic tongue that would later become Welsh, Cornish, and Cumbric. Latin lingered in administration and the church, long after it had fallen from casual speech. Over time, new Germanic tongues arrived with Anglo-Saxon settlers and warriors, setting the stage for a bilingual and, in many places, multilingual reality where words from different traditions rubbed shoulders in markets and courts. Churches offered a particular axis of continuity and change. Christian communities had taken root under Roman patronage, and monasteries and bishoprics carried on learning, record-keeping, and charity. Christian leaders often acted as intermediaries between local rulers and the broader Christian world across the sea. Monastic scribes preserved not only scripture but also the records and stories that later generations would draw on to understand their past. At the level of kingship, the face of power shifted from imperial governors to local rulers who claimed authority through kinship and control of land. Kingship became more personal and less bureaucratic than Roman administration. The prestige of a king came from war leading, hospitality, the ability to redistribute wealth, and the maintenance of loyalties through ritual and gift exchange. Across the island, regional variations were profound. In the far west and uplands, new polities consolidated around river valleys, promontory forts, and sacred sites. In the southeast, the emergence of Anglo-Saxon communities created different structures of settlement and lordship. These regional differences would solidify into a patchwork of small kingdoms, each with its own rules, customs, and strategies for survival. Armor and weaponry changed hands frequently as raiders, mercenaries, and local war bands sought plunder and prestige. Ironworking remained a crucial craft, enabling the production of tools and weapons. Smiths who could repair a plow or fashion a sword were indispensable, and their skills anchored technological continuity even as political authority fractured and reformed. Trade did not stop with the departure of Rome. Coastal communities continued to engage with continental ports, and the sea became a lifeline for goods and ideas. Irish and continental craftsmen circulated, as did luxury items that signified status, imported glass, silver brooches, and carefully wrought jewelry. Even when currency became scarcer, networks of exchange persisted through barter, gifts, and local tokens of value. The landscape bore witness to shifting agricultural patterns. Wooded areas were cleared for pasture and cereal, while field systems were reorganized to suit new patterns of ownership. Enclosures of land, either formal or ad hoc, reflected the emergence of lordly control over resources. Herds moved seasonally, and the rhythm of the agricultural year shaped the calendar of work and festival in ways that connected people across generations. Mortuary practices were one of the most telling signs of change and continuity. Burial customs combined legacy forms with new motifs, as cremation and inhumation, furnished graves, and simple earthworks signaled choices about identity and belief. High-status burials, with their grave goods and ostentatious displays, announced the presence of elite households and their links to long-standing traditions of status and display. In some places, Roman urban life persisted in attenuated form. Cities that had once been bustling centers of trade shrank but continued to host markets and ecclesiastical buildings. In other towns, stone buildings fell into ruin and were plundered for building material, their memory preserved in place names and the ghostly outlines of walls. The urban ruins became resources as much as reminders. The reception and adaptation of Christian practice produced a rich diversity of religious expression. Some communities saw a consolidation of monastic life, with monasteries becoming centers for education and welfare. Others merged Christian rites with older practices, maintaining sacred wells, holy trees, and pilgrimage routes that blended the new faith with pre-Christian landscape lore. The process was not uniform but deeply local and pragmatic. Powerful families used marriage and fosterage to secure alliances across regions. Children were raised in other households to create bonds, and marriage linked dynasties in ways that could ease conflict or spark new rivalries. Kinship was the currency of trust, and the fabric of alliances knitted together realms that could otherwise have fragmented permanently. The sea lanes were also channels of displacement. Migration to Brittany saw groups of Britons cross the Channel and establish new polities in Armorica. This movement carried language, art, and political forms, and it became a living reminder that mobility could be as much about hope as it was about flight. The migration altered demographic patterns and created fresh interconnections between the British Isles and the continental fringes. Archaeology illuminates the daily life that texts often ignore. Pottery fragments found in bogs and fields tell stories of kitchens and storage, while post holes reveal the footprints of timber houses. Faunal remains speak of diets rich in mutton, beef, pork, and fish, and pollen analysis reconstructs the cereals and pastures people tended. These material traces offer a concrete counterpoint to the large political narratives. In the north, kingdoms were shaped by proximity to the Irish and Pictish worlds. Strathclyde, Reg, and other polities maintained Celtic traditions and often engaged in warfare and diplomacy with Anglo-Saxon neighbors. The fluidity of borders meant frequent shifting of influence, with kings sometimes ruling over mixed populations who shared language and customs or alternately lived apart. The archaeological record of gold and silver hoards reflects both personal wealth and social instability. Hoards were sometimes buried as votive offerings, other times concealed during times of threat, and occasionally never reclaimed. Their distribution across the landscape offers hints about where people felt safest to hide valuables and where trade and prestige concentrated. Fortifications evolved into new forms that met the demands of local defense. Earthworks, palisades, and reused Roman forts served as refuges during raids. In some cases, small ringworks appeared along rivers and lanes as centers of lordship, signaling the emergence of a new military geography based on local control rather than imperial garrisons. Kingship was performed through ritual as well as force. Feasting and gift-giving created obligations, while law speakers and assembled elites witnessed contracts and settled disputes. The rhetorical framing of kingship, stories told around fires, poems recited by bards, helped to legitimate authority by binding memory and expectation to the person of the ruler. Legal traditions morphed out of community practice. Where Roman law had been experienced through imperial courts, local customary law asserted itself through assemblies and oral judgment. Later, in some regions, these customs would be written down in legal codes that codified practices that had evolved informally for generations, but the oral roots remained influential. Names of kingdoms often preserved older tribal identities that had survived Roman contact. Names like Dimnonia, Gwent, Powys, and Dara carry echoes of earlier political formations and geographic loyalties. These names anchored people to landscape and lineage and offered a sense of permanence in changing times. The story of the Anglo-Saxon arrival is complex and regionally varied. In some areas, pockets of settler communities established new villages and political centers that gradually absorbed earlier populations. In other areas, local Britons maintained dominance and adapted to newcomers by forming pragmatic alliances. The mixture of conflict, assimilation, and coexistence produced variegated cultural outcomes rather than a uniform takeover. Material culture reveals fusion as well as fracture. Metalwork shows hybrid styles where Celtic and Germanic artistic motifs blend, and grave goods reflect a mingling of tastes. This blending suggests that everyday life involved exchange and borrowing across cultural lines, and that identity was negotiated at household and community scales. Economics reoriented as coin circulation declined and local economies became more self-reliant. Currency remained in some use, but much trade shifted to barter, tribute, and localized production. Mills, saltworks, and smithies became essential components of sustaining local communities, and the control of these resources added to the power of local rulers. The role of women in these transformations was substantial, though often underrepresented in texts. Women managed households, oversaw production, transmitted customs, and could be agents in political alliances through marriage and fosterage. High-status women sometimes sponsored churches and monasteries, and in rare instances women exercised overt power in rulership and patronage. Sacred landscapes retained their power. Springs, standing stones, and enclosures that predated empire continued to be places of assembly, memory, and ritual. Layers of practice accumulated at these sites, so that a single place could be both an archaeological palimpsest and a living center of communal identity. Craftsmanship sustained cultural identity as much as political authority did. Potters, carvers, weavers, and metalworkers carried techniques that had been refined across generations. Their goods encoded status and local tastes and helped to signal belonging in a world where outward markers mattered to survival as well as beauty. Stories and oral traditions bridged the gap between lived memory and myth. Bards, monks, and household storytellers kept genealogies and tales alive, mixing fact with allegory to explain how certain families came to power. Over time, these tales would crystallize into the rich mythic cycles that later chroniclers would claim as national memory. Diplomacy took many shapes. Sending envoys, exchanging gifts, and hosting feasts were modes of interstate relations as meaningful as battlefield victories. Alliances could shift quickly, and a king might switch partners if a new marriage or promise of tribute provided a stronger network of support. Population movement was not just the arrival of settlers. People fled famine, sought better land, or were displaced by raiding. Refugee flows reshaped communities, bringing new blood into former strongholds and introducing stories and practices from other regions. The composition of a village or a court could change in a generation. Bilingualism became a common phenomenon in border regions. Markets, legal assemblies, and religious centers often operated with multiple tongues. People navigated multilingual settings with pragmatic facility, and this fluidity helped forge shared spaces where different cultural traditions could coexist. The accumulation of narrative was as much about memory as record. Monastic scriptoria copied lists of kings and laws, but they also preserved saints' lives and miracle stories that tied sacred precedent to local sanctity. These narratives became tools for legitimizing contemporary claims and for weaving a sense of continuity with the past. Artistic styles shifted and flowed between regions, carrying motifs and symbols that had power beyond mere decoration. Cross motifs, spirals, animal interlace, and zoomorphic forms told visual stories about belief, power, and identity. These designs traveled with craftsmen and through objects in trade, becoming visual shorthand for affiliation and prestige. The archaeological presence of compact settlements and occasional nucleated villages points to community choices about security and social life. Some communities clustered near defensible spots, while others spread across arable land and dispersed farmsteads. These choices were shaped by practicalities, soil, water, pasture, and by the social logic of gathering and feasting. Seafaring peoples exploited the island chains and coastal promontories with a skill that had old roots in Atlantic trade. Ferrymen, traders, and fishermen knew tides and currents intimately, making possible the movement of people and goods even when land routes were contested. The sea remained not only a boundary but a link that connected remote communities to broader networks. The persistence of Roman technical know-how was evident in masonry, road maintenance, and the continued use of iron tools. Knowledge passed through apprenticeships and practical necessity, carried by those who repaired rather than replaced. This practical continuity often went unremarked by chroniclers, but it shaped the physical environment people inherited. Conflict could be protracted and local. Raiding parties punctuated the agricultural year, and feuds could smolder for generations. Yet conflict produced its own conventions, truces, ransom practices, and negotiated settlements that reflected the moral economy of the age. Warfare and law were entwined in ways that managed violence without eliminating it. Monastic centers operated as hubs of literacy and learning in a landscape where most people were illiterate. They produced manuscripts, kept annals, and taught reading and copying to a small class of clerics and the occasional layman. The presence of books linked remote corners of the island to continental thought and to the Christian intellectual world. Place names preserve echoes of cultural layers. Celtic, Latin, and Germanic names exist side by side, each providing clues about earlier settlement and the memory of landscape. Rivers, hills, and towns kept names that tied them to particular peoples and stories, and those names shaped how descendants understood their patrimony. The idea of the fracture between Roman and post-Roman worlds is thus better pictured as a refracted continuity. Some things disappeared, others were transformed, and many practices were adapted to new social realities. People acted creatively in the face of uncertainty, and their choices produced social forms that were neither Roman nor modern but distinctly local. The archaeological evidence of childhood, fired clay toys, spindle whorls, and traces of schooling reminds us that ordinary life was filled with habits and hopes. Children learned craft and story at home, and they practiced the arts of household management that would sustain future generations. Socialization bound communities to the skills and memories needed for survival rather than to abstract political ideologies. Environmental change also mattered. Periods of colder or wetter weather affected harvests and could drive migration and conflict. At times, such pressures intensified competition for arable land and led to the consolidation of holdings under powerful households capable of managing scarcity. The environment was a partner in historical change, not merely a backdrop. Local elites invested in symbols of authority that displayed their power even as administrative systems changed. Rings, brooches, and patterned belts were markers of identity and status that communicated a leader's wealth and alliances. These material markers were portable forms of power, signifying prestige in both courtly and martial contexts. Religious reform and the reorientation of dioceses sometimes reflected political realities. Bishops could serve as local power brokers, mediators, and recorders of agreements. Their shifting allegiances and the locations of sees often mirrored the changing centers of political gravity across the island. Migration to continental outposts produced cultural exchange in both directions. Britain art and legal forms absorbed British influences, while ideas and fugitives returned to the island with new experiences. This continental feedback loop illustrates how the little kingdoms of Britain were never wholly insular but part of a larger European web. Ritual life created common patterns of belonging. Seasonal rites, commemorations of the dead, and localized saint cults knit communities together across generational boundaries. These shared rituals offered continuity in the face of political upheaval and helped to create a moral universe that made sense to ordinary people. The presence of high-status metalwork, whether engraved goods or hoarded treasure, signals networks of prestige and sponsorage. Artisans and patrons worked in partnership to produce objects that defined elite taste and broadcast alliance across distance. The exchange of such objects could seal agreements and sanctify remembrance. Military obligations rested on social ties as much as on levies. Young men owed service to their lord as part of their social fabric, and such service was inextricable from household membership and the honor economy. Warfare was thus communal and personal, embedded within the expectations of kinship and hospitality. The survival of certain place-based cults and pilgrimage routes attests to the resilience of sacred geography. Sites associated with saints or ancient deities kept attracting visitors and devotional energy. Such continuity anchored communities in time and drew pilgrims who carried stories and offerings across regions. Textual sources must be handled with caution because they blend reportage and agenda. Monks wrote for communities, bishops chronicled for posterity, and kings patronized texts that bolstered their claims. Reading these sources requires understanding their purposes as well as their content, which is itself part of the social fabric they describe. We should pay attention to small things: the repair of a mill, the planting of an orchard, the inscription of a gravestone. These acts speak of household endurance and care, the quiet work of survival that did as much to reshape future worlds as battles and dynastic marriages. History is made as much by these quotidian acts as by grand gestures. As kingdoms consolidated, law codes began to appear in written form, translating oral custom into fixed text. These codifications seldom froze practice entirely, but they provided templates that rulers could use to adjudicate disputes and regulate behavior. The existence of law texts shows a growing administrative capacity and a desire to stabilize social expectations. The interplay of memory and invention produced mythic figures who embodied continuity. Legends, ancestral genealogies, and heroic cycles drew on fragments of real history to make sense of the present. Over time, these stories accrued layers of meaning that tied contemporary rulers to legendary ancestors and to sacred precedent. Economic specialization increased in some regions, with artisanal centers producing goods for regional trade. Textile production, metalworking, and pottery became focal points for communities seeking to compete in wider markets. The prestige of certain products could help a kingdom to sustain its elite and fund networks of loyalty. As political units matured, they developed administrative practices that resembled older bureaucracies but at a smaller scale. Records of tribute, the collection of dues, and the maintenance of lordly households required organization and personnel. The continuity with Roman administrative habits was thus more cultural than institutional, reflecting ways of thinking about governance. Borderlands were laboratories of fusion. There, people of different tongues and customs met, traded, fought, and intermarried. Shared border customs and the negotiation of rights and passage forged relationships that endured despite periodic violence. The archaeology of religious sites reveals adaptations to changing belief systems. Early Christian basilicas sometimes stood where older shrines had been, and cemeteries display changing patterns of orientation and grave goods. These layers show how communities negotiated the sacred, blending old reverence with new doctrine. In some regions, kingship was eventually consolidated into dynasties capable of projecting power over wider territories. These dynastic formations depended on the careful cultivation of loyalty through gift and ceremony, as much as on military force. They also relied on networks of marriage, fostering, and ecclesiastical support to legitimize their claims. The memory of empire lingered in legal forms, place names, and the material record, but it was transformed into local idioms that suited changing needs. References to Roman law and imperial office persisted as markers of legitimacy long after the structures that created them had gone. People used the memory of Rome as a resource in their own political projects. Cultural identity became more diverse even as it consolidated in certain areas. Local vernaculars developed literary traditions, and saints' cults were expressed differently from one valley to the next. Such variation reveals that culture was adaptive and creative rather than passive or purely derivative. The reconstruction of social life depends on cross-disciplinary evidence. Synthesis of texts, archaeology, environmental data, and linguistics reveals the rich texture of survival and transformation. Each source fills a gap that the others cannot, and together they reveal a past that feels intimate and human rather than simply distant and foreign. In the end, the shadows after empire were full of people making do in a shifting world. They repurposed stones, rewrote traditions, forged alliances, and told stories that made sense of loss and hope. That sustained creativity is what made the medieval kingdoms of Britain possible, and it remains visible if you look carefully at the fields, the ruins, and the names that survived them. Imagine standing at the edge of a wide, misted moor in Britain long before the word kingdom was commonplace, when the land belonged to many named peoples who lived by river and ridge and shore. These were not chaotic bands with no organization, but complex societies built around king groups, loyalties, and leaders whose authority was earned by skill in war, generosity in feast, and care in arbitration. They shaped the landscape with earthworks and enclosures, and they listened to the wind in the grasses while stories of ancestors, gods, and distant trade came over the sea. To trace how these tribes evolved into the early medieval kingdoms is to follow a river of changes in language, goods, belief, and power that flowed for centuries. The first impression is of variety. Britain was a tapestry of peoples with different names and reputations, some spoken of in the accounts of Roman writers, others known chiefly by archaeology. Each tribe occupied a patch of territory, often defined by natural features like rivers and hills, and within those patches there were centers of life, hill forts on commanding spurs, settlements in valleys, and clusters of farms that shifted with the seasons. The identities of these tribes were living things, shaped by kinship, by the leaders who could command warriors and loyalty, and by the myths that told people who they were in relation to the land and to neighboring groups. Over time, as pressure from empire, trade, and migration grew, these identities would stretch and compress into something more centralized. Think first of the Iron Age, a long era when metalwork, traded goods, and artistic styles moved across the Channel and across the islands. Craftspeople worked iron and bronze, making tools and weapons that changed how people farmed and fought. The Latin style, with its flowing curves and stylized animals, arrived from the continent and found new local expressions in metalwork and decoration, visible in objects unearthed from burials and hoards. Those items tell us that the peoples of Britain were not isolated, they moved goods and people, and they belonged to a northern Atlantic world as much as a continental one. Hill forts deserve a special word because they are an image people often hold of Iron Age Britain, not mere castles, but complex centers of community, refuge, and sometimes craft. Some were densely occupied, with timber houses pressed together on fortified slopes, while others were symbolic places where the elite displayed wealth and power at public gatherings. Inside and outside these enclosures, fields stretched and animals grazed, but on festival days the hill forts could be crowded with traders, warriors, and bards. The scale and function of any given hill fort varied across the islands, reflecting local needs and connections. In the south and southeast, the coastal peoples had frequent contact with continental communities and with seafaring traders who brought wine, olive oil, and exotic goods. There is evidence of early coinage in Britain, imitation types modeled after continental examples, and later localized issues that show political ambitions and economic networks. Coinage served not only as money but as a statement of identity and authority. When a leader had his name or emblem on a coin, it was proof of political presence and reach. Such practices were seeds of centralized power because they required organization and control of resources. Leadership took many forms. Some leaders were warlords, their authority based on skill in battle and the loyalty of warriors. Others were generous hosts whose ability to redistribute food and wealth in feasts bound followers to them in webs of obligation. Kinship mattered. Claims to leadership often rested on descent from important ancestors, but personal charisma could rearrange those claims. Over time, the combination of heredity and personal power pushed some groups toward hereditary rulership and what would become dynastic kingship. Religion and ritual threaded through daily life and political power in ways we can only partly reconstruct, but graves, votive deposits, and temples suggest a lively spiritual world. Sacred places, springs, groves, and hilltops were sites where offerings were made, sometimes in water or as deposits of metalwork. The figure of the Druids appears in classical accounts as priests and advisors, although those accounts are filtered through Roman eyes. Whether or not every tribe had a formal priesthood, religion was deeply bound to social order and to claims of legitimacy made by leaders. The pottery and animal bones left behind in settlements give us a sense of domestic rhythms, family labor, seasonal cycles of planting and harvesting, and a diet of cereals, pulses, and meat. Fields were plowed with ard plows, and livestock moved in patterns that followed weather and pasture. This rural foundation underpinned everything else, because surplus agricultural production enabled craft specialization and the maintenance of warrior retinues around powerful figures. Where surplus accumulated, so too did the possibility of urban life, however modest by later standards. Trade networks threaded the island into a larger economic system that reached from the Baltic to Iberia and into the Mediterranean. Tin and other metals were valued exports, and Britain's resources made it a destination for traders and settlers. The presence of imported amphory at hill fort sites shows that wine was consumed by elites who could afford imported luxuries, and that consumption tied local leaders into wider patterns of prestige. Trade changed what people wanted and what they could show off, and it altered the balance of power by giving some leaders access to rarities that marked them as exceptional. The arrival of Rome, and the campaigns that followed, altered the trajectory of many British peoples but did not erase them. The Romans recorded tribes and leaders and built towns and roads that reoriented communication and power. They fitted some areas into a provincial order with administration and military presence, while other parts remained on the periphery, only lightly touched by imperial power. The Roman period introduced new forms of administration, new material culture, and a new language for official life, yet indigenous practices persisted and adapted in surprising ways. Where the Romans settled most intensively, towns grew up on Roman plans with streets, public buildings, and markets, and local elites adapted to these new centers of power. Some tribal leaders cooperated with Rome and became client rulers, using the imperial system to protect and extend their own authority. Others resisted. Across decades, the relationship between Romans and Britons became hybridized. Roads and walls intersected with native settlements and sacred places, producing a Romanized layer on top of older social structures. That hybridity is crucial because it set patterns of continuity that mattered when Roman administration later collapsed. The tribes that the Romans named are familiar to readers of classical texts: the Brigantes in the north, the Iceni in the east, the Silures in the west, and many others, each with a terrain and temperament. These names were sometimes imposed by outsiders and sometimes adapted by the people themselves. They signal regions of common interest rather than strict political units easily mapped onto modern borders. Within any named tribe there could be subgroups, competing lineages, and shifting alliances. Recognition of a common name could become the basis for larger polities, but it could also hide internal fragmentation. One of the most famous episodes in late Iron Age Britain is the revolt of Boudica, queen of the Iceni, and her uprising against Roman rule. Her story, dramatic and tragic, resonates because it shows how local grievances about land, status, and the humiliation of elite families could ignite wider resistance. The Romans suppressed the revolt with brutal force, but the rebellion remains a powerful reminder that Roman rule was contested and that the transition to Roman provincial life was never smooth. Boudica's memory lived on in both British and Roman imagination as a symbol of resistance. As Roman power waxed and waned, some British leaders adopted Roman titles and trappings while retaining local power bases. Villas and farms adopted Roman building styles in some regions, and Latin words entered local speech, mixed with native languages that would eventually become the Celtic tongues of medieval Britain. The Christian faith arrived during the Roman period, brought by missionaries and merchants and adopted by some elite families as a complement to Roman identity. Churches and bishops began to reshape spiritual life and literacy, creating threads that would tie later kingdoms to continental Christendom. The withdrawal of Roman administration in the 5th century created a profound political vacuum, but it did not erase social bonds or local organization. Former military sites, towns, and roads persisted as centers of population and memory. Local leaders had the opportunity to assert greater autonomy and to claim the mantle of rulership in areas formerly held by Rome. In regions where Roman civic structures remained useful, elites adapted them, while in more remote areas older forms of leadership resurfaced with renewed force. In the West and North, where Roman control was weakest, native polities endured and sometimes grew stronger as local leaders reorganized resources and loyalties. In southwestern regions like Dumnonia, native institutions remained resilient, and local kingship continued in lines that would later be reflected in medieval chronicles. In Wales and the West, small kingdoms based on earlier tribal territories began to take shape, often centered on river valleys and defensible hill sites. These polities bore the imprint of pre-Roman kinship patterns even as they incorporated new elements and new networks. The interaction with incoming groups from beyond the sea complicated the map. Germanic peoples began to arrive and settle in eastern and southern Britain, bringing their languages and customs. These migrations were varied. Some groups arrived as small raiding parties that later settled, others as larger communities pressing inland. The newcomers did not simply replace the people who were already there. They intermarried, fought, and forged alliances, producing a patchwork of zones where different cultures predominated. Over generations, the interplay of continuity and migration produced new ethnic identities and political formations. Archaeology shows that in some areas the material culture changed quickly, with pottery styles and house types shifting to forms associated with continental Germanic groups. In other areas, local building techniques and farming practices continued with little interruption. Where Anglo-Saxon settlement took root, new elites often established themselves in strategic river valleys and coastal plains, taking advantage of fertile land and access to trade. These new aristocracies gradually organized space into larger political units that would become the early English kingdoms. Language is one of the clearest traces of these changes. The Celtic languages were widespread in Britain, and they continued in the West and North, evolving into the medieval Welsh, Cornish, and Cumbric tongues. In the Southeast, Old English began to take hold, amalgamating dialects of incoming groups into a rich vernacular. The coexistence of languages left marks in place names, personal names, and legal terms, revealing a long process of bilingualism and cultural exchange. Over time, linguistic boundaries often marked political ones, but these lines were porous rather than absolute. Kingship in this transforming landscape took on new shapes. In regions influenced by Roman models, kings adopted the trappings of courtly life while integrating traditional practices of gift-giving and ritual. In Germanic-influenced polities, the bond between king and warrior retained an emphasis on personal loyalty and martial success. In Celtic areas, kingship often carried sacral overtones, with kings thought to embody the prosperity of their territories. Across all zones, kingship required the maintenance of networks, marriage alliances, fosterage of noble children, and reciprocal obligations that bound elites together. Feasting remained central to political life because it was where reputations were made and debts were acknowledged. A king who could host generous feasts and distribute wealth solidified his followers' loyalty and attracted support from distant elites. These gatherings were also moments of display, where craftsmen, storytellers, and ritual specialists performed the cultural work that made a polity feel cohesive. Feasting therefore functioned as a political technology, sustaining hierarchical structures and connecting elite households. Law and dispute resolution drew on local custom as much as on written codes, and early medieval law codes that survive show a blend of customary and newer influences. Compensation systems, where harm was met by fines or wergild, reflected a desire to keep violence from fracturing society permanently. Local assemblies, sometimes called by kings or by leading men, judged disputes and maintained public order. These gatherings were less centralized than later royal courts, but they were crucial nodes in the governance that would come to define the early kingdoms. The Christian Church played an increasingly important role in legitimizing rulers and in structuring new polities. Missionary efforts in the 5th and 6th centuries brought Christianity into contact with pagan practices, resulting in syncretic forms of worship and a gradual adoption of the new faith among elites. Monasteries became centers not only of religion but of learning, manuscript production, and economic activity. Bishops and abbots often acted as royal advisors and diplomats, and the church provided a network of literacy that kings could use to communicate across territories. Saints and holy sites became focal points for emerging kingdoms because they attracted pilgrims and redistributed prestige. The founding of a monastery could elevate a local site to regional importance, tying a royal lineage to the saintly reputation of its patron. Miracles and saintly legends were political tools as much as spiritual narratives, and they helped to anchor a people's identity in sacred geography. In time, ecclesiastical networks linked distant polities into broader Christian Europe, allowing kings to claim closer ties with continental rulers. Geography directed the locations of power. River valleys were natural corridors for movement and trade, while uplands and coasts offered defensive advantages. Rivers like the Severn, the Trent, and the Thames became axes around which political control could be projected. Coastal areas facilitated contact with continental traders and raiders alike, and islands and estuaries were prized for their control of maritime routes. Mountains and dense forests slowed travel and allowed peripheral regions to maintain distinct identities longer than lowland plains. The transformation from tribal confederations into territorial kingdoms took multiple pathways. Sometimes a charismatic leader united several tribes under a single authority through conquest or diplomacy, creating a polity large enough to be recognized as a kingdom. In other cases, economic growth around a center, perhaps a former Roman town, allowed a locality to exert influence over surrounding regions. The processes were uneven. In some areas kingdoms coalesced early and became powerful, while elsewhere smaller polities persisted for centuries. The notion of the heptarchy, the idea that England was neatly divided into 7 great kingdoms, is a later simplification that helps narrative but obscures complexity. The early medieval reality was a shifting mosaic of large and small polities, with boundaries that flexed according to marriage, war, and diplomacy. Mercia emerged as a powerful inland kingdom, Northumbria knitted together formerly distant regions in the north, and Wessex would later become the dominant power in the west. But each of these kingdoms was itself composed of older tribal territories and newly incorporated lands. In the west, the legacy of Iron Age tribes shaped the formation of Welsh kingdoms like Gwynedd and Powys, where dynastic families claimed descent from ancient rulers and invoked ancestral rights to the land. These kingdoms preserved Celtic law and custom while adapting to the new reality of Christian kingship. Military organization relied on local retinues and the mobilization of freeholders, and rulers defended their territories against both Anglo-Saxon encroachment and Viking raids. The endurance of these polities into the medieval period shows the long shadow cast by tribal foundations. In the far north, the story is even more complex, involving the Picts, the Gaelic kingdom of Dal Riata, and the shadowy interactions with Norse settlers. The Picts, who inhabited what we now call Scotland, had their own art, symbols, and political structures that have left tantalizing traces on carved stones and in place names. Dal Riata, a kingdom formed from Gaelic settlers with origins in Ireland, projected power across the Irish Sea and engaged in alliances and conflicts with Pictish neighbors. Through centuries of interaction, including through the Christianization of these regions, new polities like the Kingdom of Alba would later emerge from the fusion of Pictish and Gaelic elements. Names of peoples and places often preserved the memory of the older tribal landscape. Towns and regions in medieval records still carried echoes of tribal designations, and genealogies claimed continuity with ancestral rulers. These claims were not mere myth-making, they served to justify the rule of dynasties that traced their legitimacy to long-standing local identities. The persistence of such names guided the formation of territorial claims and the mental maps of early medieval rulers. Material culture continued to evolve after the Roman departure, showing both adaptation and innovation. Metalworking became local again in many places, with artisans producing weapons and ornaments that blended local styles with continental influences. The production of high-status items, brooches, swords, and religious objects became a way for emerging elites to signal their power. Craft centers could be found near resources, and their trade networks stitched together regions into economic systems that supported centralized rule. Warfare remained a decisive factor in who ruled and who was dispossessed. Battles and skirmishes punctuated political life, and victory could redraw the map overnight. But warfare was not the only path to power. Diplomacy, marriage, and adoption of religious prestige often sealed alliances and cemented authority. The ability of a leader to adapt to changing military technologies, to compose alliances with neighboring rulers, and to win the loyalty of key nobles could be as decisive as battlefield success. Coastal raids by seafaring peoples, later identified with Viking adventurers, began in earnest in the late 8th century, but their roots in maritime raiding extended back further, and the Atlantic world had always been a place of both trade and violence. The presence of these raiders introduced new pressures that accelerated political consolidation in some regions, as rulers built defenses and forged alliances to resist or to exploit the arriving forces. In other cases, raiders settled and mixed with local populations, founding dynasties that would play a part in the later map of kingdoms. The dynamic interplay of raiding and settlement added another layer to the story of state formation. The transformation from tribal leaders to medieval kings also involved changes in bureaucracy and public displays of authority. Kings began to use documentary practices, charters, and legal codes to assert claims over land and people, and they established courts where complaints could be heard in the presence of the ruling household. Ceremonial practices, such as the act of enthronement or coronation, became increasingly formalized, linking the sacred and civic aspects of rule. These institutional developments helped kings to stabilize their control and to transmit power across generations in more predictable ways. Cities and towns, often rooted in Roman foundations, grew into administrative centers for emerging kingdoms. Markets established regular flows of goods and information, and urban centers attracted artisans, traders, and clerics who made them hubs of political life. The existence of towns enabled kings to levy taxes, to recruit craftsmen, and to exercise currency control when coinage was used. Urbanization changed the social fabric by concentrating wealth and enabling the proliferation of written records, which in turn supported more complex governance. Education and literacy found new patrons in monastic communities and cathedral schools. Monks copied texts, preserved classical knowledge, and produced chronicles that later generations would use to reconstruct the past. Literacy gave rulers a powerful tool. They could commission texts praising their deeds, codifying laws, and establishing diplomatic communications. The spread of literacy fostered a cultural cohesion that supported kingdom building, because documents, genealogy, and saintly hagiography provided narratives that legitimized rule. Memory played a central role in political legitimacy. Dynasties cultivated origin myths and genealogies that linked them to heroic ancestors and to sacred landscapes. These narratives were often crafted to be heard aloud in halls and in churches, where they could move hearts and minds. Bards and clerics were custodians of such memories, and their performances could transform a local lord into a recognized king in the perception of people beyond his immediate territory. The past, told anew, became a political instrument. The spread of Christianity brought new administrative frameworks and also a new ethos for kingship, but it did not abolish older customs. Kings who adopted Christian symbolism used it to reinforce their authority, interweaving old ritual with Christian liturgy. Conversion often occurred among elites first, with churches and monasteries attracting patronage that enhanced royal prestige. The fusion of Christian and traditional elements resulted in forms of rulership that appealed to both sacred and secular sensibilities. Military architecture evolved in response to new threats and new political realities. Earthworks were refurbished, and bows, fortified settlements, were sometimes constructed as defensive centers. The creation of baths in Anglo-Saxon England, for example, represented a strategic response to raiding and to the need for secure hubs of commerce and administration. These fortified places served as foci for royal power and as places where communities could rally in times of danger. In areas that maintained older forms of fortification, hill forts and defended enclosures continued to be important. Diplomacy and marriage alliances knitted disparate territories together into larger political formations. A king who could marry into other royal families extended his influence beyond his immediate borders, and fosterage, a practice of sending noble children to be raised in other households, created bonds of obligation and affinity that could last a lifetime. These networks of kinship and obligation formed the scaffolding of medieval politics, enabling kings to call on allies in war and to secure peace through family ties. Such practices reveal how personal relationships could scale up to shape political geography. Customary obligations between lords and followers shaped the army a king could field, but professional retinues and mercenary bands also played a role, especially when kings competed over larger territories. Mercenaries were often foreign, and they could be decisive in battles where local levies were insufficient. The availability of wealth to pay such forces depended on control of lands, trade, and tribute, resources that in turn depended on effective governance. Therefore, military might was both an instrument and a consequence of successful state formation. Environmental change, too, influenced political developments. Shifts in climate affected harvests and could create pressures for migration or conflict over resources. River courses changed, and so did the usability of certain lands for agriculture. Over generations, communities adapted by reallocating land, by reorganizing their agricultural systems, and by altering settlement patterns. The capacity of rulers to manage these changes through redistributive mechanisms, legal regulation, or engineering projects affected their legitimacy and survival. Archaeological finds like hoards buried in times of crisis tell stories of uncertainty and adaptation. People hid their valuables when danger seemed imminent, often never to reclaim them. Such deposits reveal the disruptions that marked the transition from the Roman world into the medieval era, times when trade faltered, when political order was uncertain, and when communities acted in the face of threat. Interpreting these material traces helps us imagine the everyday decisions that underpinned larger historical changes. Regional variation remained striking throughout the period. In the Southeast and East, Anglo-Saxon cultural patterns took hold relatively early, producing distinct styles of grave goods, housing, and metalwork. In the West, continuity with earlier Celtic practices persisted in art and law. The North and Northwest developed their own syntheses through interactions among Britons, Gaels, Picts, and later Norse immigrants. This variation meant that the path to kingdomhood was not uniform but depended on local resources, histories, and external pressures. The preservation of law codes in later centuries gives us a window into the concerns of early medieval societies: compensation for injury, regulation of land, and the definition of social status. These codes codified pre-existing customs but also shaped behavior by setting standards for royal justice. They provide modern readers with legal categories that illuminate the social hierarchies and expectations of early medieval life. Law helped to standardize relations and provided rulers with a language of governance that could be applied throughout a realm. The rise of great dynasties such as the Mercian house under Offa, the Northumbrian dynasties that produced powerful kings, and the West Saxon line that would come to unify much of England did not happen overnight. Each of these dynasties built on centuries of local development, interwoven with Roman legacy, tribal leadership, and new influences from migrants. Offa's establishment of coinage, diplomatic correspondence with continental rulers, and attempts at ecclesiastical reform illustrate how a king could integrate many levers of power. Yet these successes always rested on the older foundations of kinship and local governance. Scotland's eventual consolidation under a single crown emerged from the tangled relations of Pictish kingdoms, Gaelic Dalriada, Norse settlements, and later Anglo-Norman influences. It was a slow process of alliances, conquests, and cultural blending, where the identities of peoples were remade across centuries. Welsh polities remained distinct even as they interacted with their English neighbors, maintaining legal and cultural frameworks that set them apart. In Ireland, different dynamics produced their own set of kingdoms, but the island's connections to Western Britain influenced the politics of the British mainland. The narrative of tribes to kingdoms must pay attention to the role of everyday people, not only elite maneuverings. Farmers, artisans, women who managed households and dowries, and children raised in fosterage systems all contributed to the social fabric that supported political structures. Their labor, mobility, and cultural practices formed the substrate upon which kings built. Understanding kingdom formation requires listening to the small sounds of ordinary life: the turning of the millstone, the rhythm of the plow, the lullaby sung in a longhouse, which shaped values and sustained communities. Material culture also carried status markers into the medieval world. Clothing, brooches, belts, and weapons signified rank, and the decoration on these items could signal alliances or cultural affiliations. The adoption of continental fashions by some elites signaled prestige, while local styles continued to be worn in other communities as markers of identity. The interplay of dress and display was a language of power that could be read across social strata. Monumental art and symbols, the carved stones of Pict land, the early Christian crosses, and the unique metalwork of various regions helped forge identities that were both local and regional. These objects anchored narratives about ancestry and sacred history, and their creation required skilled artists supported by patrons who wished to be remembered. Public art became a medium through which rulers and religious institutions projected their values and claims, effectively broadcasting who mattered in the social order. The consolidation of territories into kingdoms also involved fiscal innovations. Rulers sought reliable sources of revenue, whether through tribute, fines, trade levies, or the exploitation of natural resources like mines and fisheries. Control over ports and trading sites could enrich a kingdom and fund armies or fortifications. The ability to administer and extract resources depended on stable governance and networks of officials, sometimes drawn from local elites who were rewarded for service. Overlapping identities in border regions created diplomatic challenges but also opportunities for hybrid cultures. In zones where Brittonic and Anglo-Saxon populations lived side by side, bilingualism and cultural exchange were common. Such regions became laboratories of cultural synthesis, producing art, law, and social practices that reflected mixed heritage. The presence of mixed communities also complicated claims of absolute sovereignty, forcing rulers to negotiate with local leaders who could leverage multiple identities. The medieval record that we inherit, chronicles, annals, hagiographies, and legal texts, must be read critically because it filters the past through the concerns of later authors. These writers shaped narratives to serve contemporary audiences, emphasizing certain lineages, victories, or saintly foundations at the expense of other perspectives. Archaeology provides a parallel story that can confirm, nuance, or contradict textual claims, creating a richer picture when both sources are used together. The interplay of text and material culture helps us reconstruct the messy reality of transformation from tribal groups to coherent kingdoms. Military innovation, shifts in weaponry, armor, and tactics recast the nature of warfare and thus of political power. The sword became a symbol of elite status, and its patterning and manufacture were matters of prestige. Cavalry became more important in certain regions, changing the strategic calculations of battlefield commanders. Innovations paced themselves unevenly across regions, with geography, economies, and cultural preferences shaping how quickly new forms of warfare took hold. Religion continued to shape alliances and enmities. Conversion to Christianity could open diplomatic channels with continental rulers and attract clerical support, but it could also provoke resistance among those who saw new faith as a threat to traditional practices. The conversion process was often pragmatic and elite-driven, with rulers using the new faith to consolidate power and adopt continental models of kingship. Over centuries, Christianity provided a unifying cultural layer that connected the British kingdoms to European Christendom. Royal courts evolved into centers of cultural production. Poets and clerics who gathered at court produced genealogies, songs, and chronicles that reinforced the status of patrons. The patronage of learning and art became a way for kings to advertise their refinement and legitimacy, and the circulation of texts helped to spread ideas between polities. Courtly life thus became not only a political but also a cultural engine for kingdom building. Even as kingdoms emerged, local community institutions retained power and influence. Village assemblies, king councils, and arbitration rituals continued to mediate disputes and manage local affairs. These institutions provided the social glue that allowed larger political structures to function because rulers depended on local elites to implement their decisions. The balance between central authority and local autonomy was delicate, negotiated continuously through custom, coercion, and compromise. Trade and currency networks began to knit larger regions together, facilitating economic integration that underpinned political consolidation. Coinage spread and standardized exchange in many areas, while barter and commodity exchange remained important in others. Ports and riverine markets became engines of growth and nodes of connectivity, enabling rulers to draw wealth from wider networks. The economic base of a kingdom mattered as much as its battlefield successes in ensuring longevity. Over generations, the institutional habits of kingship hardened into recognizable patterns: royal households with attendant officials, legal codes that outlined rights and responsibilities, and ecclesiastical structures that supported political claims. These patterns were not immutable. They were adapted to local conditions and to the pressures of war, disease, and migration. Yet they formed a framework that allowed rulers to govern larger territories than had been possible in the purely tribal past. The transformation from tribes to kingdoms did not erase memory of the earlier world. Ancestral claims, sacred topography, and traditional obligations remained part of the political vocabulary of medieval rulers. In many cases, invoking a tribal past was a strategy to legitimize contemporary claims, presenting a dynasty as the rightful heir to ancient customs and territories. The past was a political resource, used to bind people to rulers and to create a continuity that outlived the upheavals of centuries. Gradual processes of codification and record-keeping meant that later kings could appeal to legal precedents and documented grants, giving their rule an aura of legality that tribal leadership lacked. Charters that granted land to churches or to loyal followers preserved the transactions that built a kingdom's resource base. This documentary culture, supported by monastic scribes, helped stabilize property relations and enabled rulers to plan longer-term strategies for consolidation. As kingdoms matured, their leaders engaged in more ambitious diplomacy with continental powers, marrying into foreign dynasties, negotiating trade, and sometimes seeking papal or imperial recognition. These connections placed British rulers within a broader European political web, giving them models for statecraft and ecclesiastical organization that they could adapt. Continental contacts also brought military and cultural innovations that influenced the shape of emerging polities. Finally, the historical process that turned tribal polities into early medieval kingdoms was long and iterative, full of fits and starts, local experiments, and sudden ruptures. It was not a linear march toward centralization, but a patchwork of converging factors: economic, religious, military, and social, that collectively produced new political forms. The kingdoms that emerged in medieval Britain were heirs to both an ancient tribal world and to centuries of contact with neighboring cultures, making their origins a story of adaptation as much as of conquest. To listen to this story is to hear layers of time: the measured thud of the plow, the shouted commands on a battlefield, the quiet copying of a manuscript in a monastery, the clink of coins in a market stall, and the murmured lineage recited at a hall. Each sound represents human choices made in response to opportunity and danger, to weather and war, to faith and fame. The kingdoms that later dominated medieval Britain were not sudden inventions, but the slow coalescence of these sounds into a rhythm of political life. And so the map of medieval Britain, with its kingdoms and borders, is best understood not as a fixed painting but as an evolving landscape where old loyalties and new structures overlapped. Tribal names and practices survived within new frameworks that reinterpreted their meaning. Kings emerged who combined the ancient arts of gift and lineage with innovations in law, faith, and administration, creating polities that could withstand centuries of challenge and change. In that interplay between the old and the new, the foundations of medieval Britain were laid, stone upon stone, story upon story, until they became the familiar kingdoms that shaped the medieval world. Kings rose from ancient loyalties and new laws. Subscribe if you'd have stood with them as they built a new order, and comment below which side you'd have chosen.